Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In the quiet town of Valley Springs, California, a tragic event unfolded in 2013 that would forever alter the lives of its residents. The central figure in this harrowing tale is Layla Fowler, a 12-year-old girl whose life was cut short under mysterious and heartbreaking circumstances. Layla was known in her community as a bright and cheerful young girl. She had a passion for reading and was an active participant in her school's extracurricular activities. Her family, consisting of her father, Barney Fowler, her stepmother, and her older brother, were well regarded in the community. The Fowlers lived in a modest home on Ripon Road, surrounded by neighbors who described them as friendly and close-knit. On April 27, 2013, the tranquility of Valley Springs was shattered. Layla's 12-year-old brother, whose name is withheld due to his age, called 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home and attacked his sister. According to his account, he was alone with Layla when he encountered a tall man with long gray hair fleeing the scene. He then discovered his sister suffering from multiple stab wounds. Despite immediate medical attention, Layla succumbed to her injuries. The initial response from law enforcement was swift. A manhunt ensued, with officers canvassing the area based on the brothers' description of the alleged intruder. The community was on edge, with many fearing that a dangerous individual was on the loose. Schools were placed on lockdown, and residents were urged to remain vigilant. As the investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge in the brothers' account. Forensic evidence from the crime scene did not align with the presence of an outside intruder. There were no signs of forced entry, and DNA evidence pointed towards someone within the household. After thorough investigation and mounting evidence, the brother was arrested on May 11, 2013, and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as residents grappled with the revelation that the tragedy was not the result of an external threat, but stemmed from within the family. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally charged. Given the brother's age, the case was initially handled in juvenile court. However, due to the severity of the crime, prosecutors sought to have him tried as an adult. This decision sparked debates about the juvenile justice system and the appropriate handling of serious crimes committed by minors. In September 2015, after a lengthy trial, the brother was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to a juvenile facility, with the possibility of being held until the age of 23. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the community, but the emotional scars remained. The Fowler family, once seen as a pillar of the community, was now fractured by an unimaginable tragedy. The case of Layla Fowler serves as a somber reminder of the complexities and hidden struggles that can exist within families. It underscores the importance of mental health awareness and the need for open dialogues to address underlying issues before they escalate into irreversible actions. For the residents of Valley Springs, the memory of that fateful day in 2013 remains a poignant chapter in their collective history. As the news of Layla Fowler's murder spread across the small town of Valley Springs, a palpable sense of fear and grief settled over the community. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut, and whispers of a violent intruder filled the air. The idea that a stranger had broken into a home in broad daylight and murdered an innocent 8-year-old girl sent shockwaves through the town. Law enforcement immediately launched a manhunt, bringing in K-9 units, helicopters, and dozens of officers from surrounding areas. Neighbors were interviewed, their homes searched, and tips poured in from concerned citizens. At first, the entire investigation hinged on the testimony of Layla's 12-year-old brother. He had called 911 in a frantic voice, reporting that an intruder had entered their home and attacked his sister. He described the suspect as a tall man with long gray hair, dressed in dark clothing, running away from the scene. Authorities scoured the town for anyone matching the description. Residents were asked to check their security cameras, and roadblocks were set up to catch any potential suspects trying to flee. For days, the community remained on high alert, convinced that a killer was roaming free. The Fowler family, already devastated by Layla's death, was placed under immense scrutiny. Her father, Barney Fowler, made tearful pleas for the killer to come forward, while Layla's stepmother expressed her anguish on social media, describing the nightmare their family was enduring. Candlelight vigils were held in Layla's honor, with hundreds of people showing up to mourn the loss of the young girl. Posters with the suspect's description were plastered around town, and residents anxiously awaited an arrest. But as the investigation progressed, something didn't add up. Detectives working the case began noticing inconsistencies in the brother's story. His timeline of events kept shifting, and his emotional responses appeared forced. The forensic evidence at the scene raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints from an unknown person, and no evidence of an intruder's presence. The murder weapon, a knife from the family's kitchen, had no fingerprints except for those belonging to the household members. Even more troubling, DNA results did not match anyone outside of the home. As law enforcement turned their focus inward, the brother's behavior became increasingly suspicious. Friends and classmates described him as quiet and withdrawn, but no one could believe he was capable of such an act. Teachers recalled moments where he displayed frustration and anger, but nothing that indicated a violent nature. However, detectives uncovered troubling internet searches on the family's computer, searches related to crime, murder, and forensic evidence. After nearly 2 weeks of investigation, on May 11, 2013, the authorities made a shocking announcement. Layla's brother was being arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The revelation sent shockwaves through the town. People who had once rallied behind the boy, believing his story of an intruder, were now faced with the horrifying reality that Layla's murderer had been inside the home all along. In court, the prosecution painted a grim picture. They argued that the murder was an impulsive act of rage, not premeditated but fueled by frustration and anger. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that the boy was too young to fully comprehend his actions, and that he did not have the intent to kill his sister. The case quickly became a heated debate about juvenile justice. Should a 12-year-old be tried as an adult for such a heinous crime? Psychological evaluations were ordered, and experts debated whether the boy exhibited signs of deeper psychological issues. His legal team pushed for rehabilitation over punishment, arguing that he was still a child who could be reformed. Meanwhile, Layla's grieving family struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could a brother, someone she had grown up with and trusted, be responsible for her death? What had driven him to such an unthinkable act? The trial was drawn out for years, with the prosecution and defense presenting conflicting theories. The lack of a clear motive left many unanswered questions. Some speculated that sibling rivalry had escalated into uncontrollable anger, while others believed there was something deeper at play. By the time the verdict was delivered in 2015, the small town of Valley Springs had changed forever. The case had not only robbed them of a bright young girl, but it had also shattered the belief that violence only came from the outside. In this instance, the danger had come from within. The courtroom was packed on the day of the verdict. Reporters lined the hallways, eager to capture the final chapter of a case that had haunted Valley Springs for over 2 years. Residents who had once prayed for justice now found themselves grappling with an impossible truth. Justice, in this case, meant holding a 12-year-old accountable for the brutal murder of his younger sister. The judge entered the room, and a tense silence fell over the crowd. The prosecution had spent months meticulously piecing together the evidence, painting a grim picture of a crime committed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. They argued that despite the boy's age, the severity of his actions warranted punishment. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency, emphasizing his young mind, his lack of criminal history, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Experts had weighed in, analyzing his psychological state, his capacity for understanding right from wrong, and whether he posed a continued threat to society. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with the weight of the decision. He found the boy guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing him to a juvenile facility until the age of 23. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The punishment was harsh for a child, but not nearly as severe as it could have been had he been tried as an adult. He would not face life in prison, but he would spend the rest of his adolescence behind bars. Layla's family sat in silence. Her father, Barney Fowler, stared ahead blankly, his face lined with exhaustion. His son, once a boy he had tucked into bed and taken to school, was now being led away in handcuffs. His daughter, once full of life and laughter, was gone forever. How had his family come to this? What had gone wrong? Outside the courthouse, the reaction was divided. Some believed justice had been served, while others felt that no child should be locked away for over a decade, no matter the crime. Debates erupted across the country about how the legal system should handle violent offenses committed by minors. Was it possible for a child who had committed such a brutal act to be rehabilitated? Could he ever reintegrate into society? Or was he destined to remain a danger forever? Over the next few months, life in Valley Springs slowly began to settle into a new normal, though the scars of the tragedy remained. The Fowler family's once warm home sat empty for a long time, a painful reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. The whispers that had once filled the town eventually faded, but the memory of what had happened never truly left. At the juvenile facility, the boy remained mostly quiet. He rarely spoke about the crime, and when he did, his answers were vague, lacking the remorse people hoped to hear. Was he too young to fully grasp the gravity of his actions, or was he choosing to bury the truth deep inside himself? Psychologists worked with him, trying to unravel the layers of his mind, searching for answers to the questions that still haunted his family and the community. Layla's room remained untouched for months after her death. Her bed was still neatly made, her favorite stuffed animals arranged just as she had left them. Her stepmother found herself standing in the doorway often, unable to move forward, but unable to turn away. Eventually, the family packed up and moved away, unable to bear the weight of their sorrow in a town where every corner held a memory. For the people of Valley Springs, the murder of Layla Fowler was more than just a tragic crime. It was a painful lesson about the hidden darkness that can exist in even the most seemingly ordinary families. Parents, once confident in the safety of their homes, now looked at their children with new, unspoken fears. They wondered what warning signs they had missed, what unspoken anger might be festering behind innocent faces. By the time the boy turned 18, discussions began about what would happen when he was eventually released. Would he be rehabilitated? Would he be able to reintegrate into the world? Or would he carry the shadow of his crime with him forever? Some believed he deserved a second chance. Others believed he could never be trusted again. In the years that followed, the tragedy of Layla Fowler faded from national headlines, but in Valley Springs, it remained an open wound. The community never truly healed. How could they, when a young girl was buried too soon, and the person responsible was supposed to be the one who loved her most? The finality of the case did not bring the closure people had hoped for. Justice had been served, but justice could not bring Layla back. Justice could not undo the pain her family endured. And justice could not answer the one question that still lingered in the minds of everyone who had followed the case. Why? Why had a brother turned against his sister? What had truly happened in that house on the day of her murder? No one would ever know the full truth, except for the boy who took her life. And some secrets, it seemed, would be carried to the grave. Story 2. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December 27, 1944, in Guildford, New South Wales, Australia. He was the fifth of 14 children in a family that was anything but ordinary. His parents, both Yugoslav immigrants, ran a strict and often violent household, where discipline was enforced with an iron fist. Growing up in such an environment, Ivan and his siblings were no strangers to trouble. By his teenage years, Ivan had already started showing signs of delinquency, engaging in petty theft, breaking into houses, and getting into fights. Despite his criminal tendencies, Ivan appeared, on the surface, to be a relatively normal man. He was physically strong, well-built, and had an unassuming demeanor that made people believe he was just another blue-collar worker. He found steady work as a road worker, operating heavy machinery for the New South Wales Department of Main Roads. To those who didn't know him well, he seemed like a hard-working man, someone who kept to himself and minded his own business. But beneath the surface, Ivan Milat harbored dark desires that would soon make him one of the most notorious serial killers in Australian history. Between 1989 and 1993, the lush, dense forests of the Belanglo State Forest became the burial ground for his victims. 7 young backpackers, 2 Australians, 3 Germans, and 2 Britons, vanished without a trace while hitchhiking between Sydney and Melbourne. The disappearance of young travelers wasn't entirely unusual, as many adventurous souls took to hitchhiking to explore the country on a budget. But as months turned into years, and the missing travelers never made contact with their families, authorities began to suspect that something far more sinister was at play. The first major break in the case came in September 1992, when 2 runners stumbled upon a horrifying discovery in the Belanglo State Forest. The decomposed bodies of British backpackers Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters were found in shallow graves. Joanne had been stabbed multiple times in a frenzied attack, while Caroline had been shot at least 10 times in the head. The brutal nature of the murders shocked the public, and police feared they had a serial killer on their hands. A year later, in October 1993, another grim discovery was made. The remains of 3 more victims, Gabor Neugebauer, Anya Habschied, and Deborah Everest, were found in the same forest. Each of them had been subjected to horrific violence. Anya Habschied had been decapitated, her skull never recovered, while Gabor and Deborah had both suffered multiple stab wounds. The similarities between these murders and the earlier ones led investigators to the chilling realization that the same person was responsible for all of them. The case gained nationwide attention, and the media dubbed the unknown killer the backpacker murderer. The police worked tirelessly, combing through missing persons reports, tracking the last known movements of the victims, and gathering any possible clues that could lead them to the killer. The pressure was mounting, and the fear among the public was palpable. Hitchhikers became wary, and many young travelers changed their plans, unwilling to risk becoming the next victim. Then, in November 1993, the remains of 2 more victims, James Gibson and Simone Schmidl, were found. James and Simone had been missing since 1989, meaning the killer had been operating for years without detection. The brutality of the murders was consistent with the previous victims: stabbing, gunshot wounds, and evidence that the victims had been tortured before their deaths. Police now knew that they were dealing with a methodical and sadistic killer, someone who enjoyed inflicting pain and taking lives. But despite the gruesome discoveries, the killer remained unidentified. Authorities worked with behavioral experts to create a psychological profile, concluding that the perpetrator was likely a local man, familiar with the area, and possibly someone who had a history of violence. However, without solid evidence or a lead, the case stalled. It seemed as though the killer might never be caught. Everything changed in early 1994 when police received a tip that would break the case wide open. A British backpacker named Paul Onions came forward with a terrifying story. In 1990, Paul had been hitchhiking near the area where the bodies were found when he was picked up by a man who introduced himself as Bill. At first, everything seemed normal, but as they drove, the man's behavior changed. He became erratic, asking strange questions and making unsettling comments. Then, without warning, the driver pulled out a gun and a rope. Realizing he was in imminent danger, Paul managed to escape, running for his life along the road until he flagged down a passing car. He never reported the incident to police at the time, thinking it was just a close call. But after hearing about the backpacker murders on the news, he knew instantly that the man who had tried to abduct him was the same man responsible for the killings. Paul Onion's testimony gave the police the lead they desperately needed. He worked with investigators to create a composite sketch, and his description of the attacker's vehicle led them to one name: Ivan Milat. When police looked into his history, they found a disturbing past filled with violence, previous arrests, and an obsession with firearms. Everything started to fall into place, and police finally had their prime suspect. On May 22, 1994, in a massive operation involving dozens of officers, police raided Milat's home. What they found inside left no doubt that he was the backpacker murderer. Hidden in his house and in a shed on his property were weapons matching those used in the killings, camping equipment belonging to the victims, and chillingly, items that had been taken as trophies from each person he murdered. The evidence was overwhelming, and Ivan Milat was arrested on the spot. The news of his arrest spread quickly, sending shockwaves across Australia. People who had known Milat were stunned. He had always been seen as a quiet, reserved man who kept to himself. No one could have imagined that behind his calm exterior lurked a ruthless serial killer who had preyed on innocent travelers for years. As Milat sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, police continued to investigate whether he had more victims. There were dozens of unsolved missing persons cases that bore similarities to his modus operandi. Some believed he had killed many more than just the 7 known victims. However, despite speculation, no additional bodies were ever conclusively linked to him. The trial of Ivan Milat began in 1996, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors like Paul Onions testified, describing their terrifying encounters with him. Forensic experts presented the damning proof found in his home. The jury deliberated for 3 days before delivering a guilty verdict on all 7 counts of murder. Milat was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Even after being locked away, Milat never admitted to his crimes. He maintained his innocence until his death in 2019, despite the irrefutable evidence against him. Investigators remained convinced that he had killed more than just the 7 backpackers, but with his refusal to confess, those secrets died with him. The backpacker murders left a permanent scar on Australia. The case not only led to changes in how missing persons cases were handled, but also served as a grim warning about the dangers of hitchhiking. Today, the Belanglo State Forest remains a place forever associated with horror, a chilling reminder of the evil that once lurked in its depths. The trial of Ivan Milat was one of the most highly publicized in Australian history. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, families of the victims, and members of the public eager to see justice served. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, detailing Milat's calculated and sadistic methods. The jurors listened in horror as forensic experts described the injuries inflicted upon the victims. Stab wounds so deep they suggested immense force, gunshot wounds fired with precision, and signs of restraint that indicated the victims had been held captive before being killed. One of the most chilling aspects of the trial was the forensic evidence linking Milat directly to the murders. The police had found numerous items belonging to the victims inside his home. Sleeping bags, clothing, backpacks, and cameras were hidden away in his bedroom and garage. A search of his property also uncovered an arsenal of weapons, including a .22 caliber rifle that matched the gun used in several of the killings. Ballistics testing confirmed that the same rifle had been used to execute some of the victims. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Milat remained defiant. He denied any involvement in the murders, claiming he was being framed by the police. His legal team attempted to argue that the evidence had been planted and that there was no direct proof linking him to the killings. But their defense quickly fell apart as more damning testimony came to light. One of the most critical witnesses was Paul Onions, the British backpacker who had survived a terrifying encounter with Milat in 1990. Taking the stand, Paul recounted in detail how Milat had picked him up while he was hitchhiking south of Sydney. At first, Milat had seemed friendly, engaging in casual conversation and asking about Paul's travels. But as they drove, his demeanor changed. He became silent, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun and a length of rope. Paul knew he was in danger. Thinking quickly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and flung himself out of the moving car, running as fast as he could along the highway. Shots rang out behind him, but he didn't stop. He flagged down another driver, who helped him escape. At the time, he hadn't gone to the police, believing he was just lucky to be alive. But years later, when he saw news reports about the backpacker murders, he knew immediately that Ivan Milat was the man who had tried to kill him. Paul's testimony was devastating for the defense. His detailed description of Milat's vehicle, his mannerisms, and the way he had threatened him matched exactly with what investigators had pieced together about the killer's behavior. It was the missing link that tied Milat to the murders beyond any reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, the families of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening to the gruesome details of how their loved ones had been brutally murdered. Some wept quietly, while others stared blankly, unable to process the horrors being recounted. For years, they had held out hope that their children were still alive, perhaps lost somewhere or unable to contact them. Now they were faced with the undeniable truth. These young travelers had met a terrifying and painful end at the hands of a sadistic predator. The media coverage of the trial was relentless. Newspapers printed front-page stories about the evidence, the testimonies, and the grisly nature of the crimes. Television networks ran special reports analyzing every detail of Milat's past, his possible motivations, and the methods he had used to lure his victims. The public was both horrified and fascinated by the case, with many struggling to comprehend how a man who had seemed so ordinary could be responsible for such unspeakable acts of violence. As the prosecution continued to build their case, more disturbing details emerged about Milat's personal life. Former acquaintances and family members described him as controlling and prone to sudden fits of rage. Some recalled instances where he had expressed disturbing fantasies about harming people, though no one had taken him seriously at the time. His ex-wife testified that he had been abusive during their marriage, often brandishing weapons and making threats. She admitted that she had been afraid of him, but never imagined he was capable of murder. The psychological profile of Ivan Milat painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who took pleasure in inflicting pain. Experts suggested that he had likely been hunting for victims long before the backpacker murders began. His knowledge of remote areas, his access to weapons, and his ability to manipulate people made him a highly dangerous predator. There was even speculation that he might have had accomplices, as some of the evidence suggested multiple people could have been involved. However, Milat never implicated anyone else, and no other arrests were made in connection with the case. After weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the trial finally neared its conclusion. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The families of the victims held hands, bracing themselves for the moment they had been waiting for. The foreman of the jury stood and announced the verdict: guilty on all 7 counts of murder. Gasps and quiet sobs filled the room as the weight of the decision sank in. The judge wasted no time in sentencing Ivan Milat to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, never to walk free again. Milat showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He remained expressionless, as if he had already accepted his fate. But even after being convicted, he continued to maintain his innocence, refusing to admit to the killings despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The families of the victims expressed relief that justice had been served, though the pain of their loss would never fully heal. Some found solace in knowing that Milat would never be able to harm anyone again, while others struggled with the lingering questions. Why had he chosen their loved ones? What had driven him to commit such horrific crimes? In the years that followed, speculation continued about whether Milat had more victims. Investigators reopened several cold cases involving missing persons who had disappeared under similar circumstances. Though no definitive links were ever established, many believed that the true extent of Milat's crimes would never be fully known. While Milat rotted away in prison, the impact of his crimes lingered. The case led to significant changes in how missing persons cases were handled in Australia, as well as increased awareness about the dangers of hitchhiking. The once peaceful Belanglo State Forest, which had been a place of adventure for campers and travelers, became forever associated with horror and death. Milat spent his remaining years in solitary confinement, his health deteriorating as he aged. In 2019, after being diagnosed with terminal cancer, he was transferred to a hospital for treatment. Even in his final days, he refused to admit his guilt, taking his secrets to the grave. The backpacker murders remain one of the darkest chapters in Australian history. The case is a chilling reminder that true evil can exist behind the most ordinary of facades. For those who lost their loved ones, the pain never fully faded. Their children had set out on journeys of adventure, only to cross paths with a monster lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. Even with Ivan Milat locked away for life, the horrors he inflicted left scars that could never fully heal. The families of the victims spent years trying to come to terms with their loss, grappling with the unimaginable suffering their loved ones endured in their final moments. Some sought therapy, some found solace in activism, pushing for better safety measures for backpackers and travelers. Others, however, remained trapped in their grief, unable to move past the knowledge that their children had fallen prey to one of the most sadistic killers in Australian history. As time passed, the legend of the backpacker murderer grew. Books, documentaries, and films explored the case in excruciating detail, trying to piece together what had driven a seemingly normal man to commit such monstrous acts. Investigators and crime experts speculated endlessly about whether Milat had killed more than just the 7 confirmed victims. One of the most haunting questions that lingered was whether Milat had acted alone. Some investigators believed that his crimes were too elaborate, too methodical for a single person to execute without assistance. There were reports from surviving victims who claimed they had seen another person in Milat's vehicle or had heard a second voice during their abduction attempts. However, no solid evidence ever surfaced to confirm the presence of an accomplice. Milat himself remained silent on the matter, refusing to provide any information even as he neared death. For years, the Belanglo State Forest remained a place of eerie silence, forever tainted by the horror buried beneath its trees. Some travelers avoided it entirely, unwilling to step foot in a place where so many had suffered. Others, however, were drawn to it, their curiosity outweighing their fear. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and even ghost hunters ventured into the forest, searching for traces of the past, for some lingering presence of the souls lost there. In prison, Milat maintained the same cold arrogance he had displayed during his trial. He showed no remorse, no indication that he felt any guilt for what he had done. He repeatedly appealed his conviction, claiming he had been framed, but his attempts at freedom were futile. The evidence against him was undeniable, and the courts refused to entertain his pleas. As the years dragged on, Milat's health began to decline. He suffered from a range of medical issues, but true to his nature, He refused treatment at times, as if trying to exert control over his fate. In 2019, he was diagnosed with terminal esophageal and stomach cancer. Even in his dying days, he remained unrepentant, refusing to confess to the murders. When news of Milat's impending death broke, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as justice finally catching up to him, a slow and painful demise that he fully deserved. Others felt frustrated, knowing that with his death, any chance of uncovering the full truth about his crimes would be lost forever. Investigators made one last attempt to extract a confession from him, to get answers for the families who still had questions. But Milat refused, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. On October 27, 2019, Ivan Milat died in a secure wing of Sydney's Long Bay prison. His death did not bring closure, nor did it erase the pain he had caused. The families of his victims did not celebrate. There was no joy in the death of a monster, only the lingering sorrow of lives taken too soon. The case of the backpacker murders remains one of Australia's most infamous crimes. It changed the way people viewed hitchhiking, turning what was once a common practice into a dangerous gamble. It led to changes in law enforcement, prompting new measures to track missing persons more efficiently. And most importantly, it left behind a tragic reminder of how easily innocence can be stolen by the cruelest of hands. Even today, the shadows of Ivan Milat's crimes linger. The Belanglo State Forest still carries the weight of its bloody history, a silent witness to the horror that unfolded within its depths. The victims' names are etched in stone, in the memories of their families, in the stories told to warn future generations. They will never be forgotten. But Ivan Milat, despite the notoriety he craved, will not be remembered as anything more than what he truly was: a cowardly, remorseless predator who preyed on the innocent and left behind nothing but grief, terror, and unanswered questions. Story 3. In the bustling city of Mumbai, India, a heinous crime unfolded in 2013 that would shock the nation and ignite widespread discussions about women's safety. At the center of this tragic event were 5 individuals: Muhammad Qasim Hafiz Sheikh, also known as Qasim, Muhammad Salim Ansari, Vijay Jadhav, Siraj Rahman Khan, alias Serju, and a juvenile whose identity remains protected due to legal reasons. These men, hailing from underprivileged backgrounds, had a history of petty crimes and were familiar with the darker underbelly of the city. Their lives intersected in a manner that would lead them down a path of unimaginable cruelty. On the evening of August 22, 2013, a 22-year-old photojournalist, interning with an English-language magazine, set out on an assignment with a male colleague. Their destination was the abandoned Shakti Mills compound, located near Mahalakshmi in South Mumbai. Once a thriving textile mill, Shakti Mills had long been deserted, its dilapidated structures standing as silent witnesses to the passage of time. The compound, overgrown with wild foliage and littered with debris, had become a secluded spot, often frequented by those seeking solitude or engaging in illicit activities away from the prying eyes of the public. As the duo ventured deeper into the compound, the fading daylight cast eerie shadows, and the distant hum of the city seemed worlds away. Unbeknownst to them, they were being watched. The 5 perpetrators, familiar with the labyrinthine layout of the mills, had been lurking in the vicinity, seeking an opportunity to assert their dominance and indulge their depraved desires. Spotting the unsuspecting pair, they saw an opportunity to exploit. The men approached the photojournalist and her colleague under the pretense of questioning their presence in the area. Feigning authority, they accused the duo of trespassing and threatened them with dire consequences. The situation escalated rapidly. The assailants overpowered the male colleague, binding his hands with belts and leading him away, rendering him helpless. Isolated and vulnerable, the photojournalist was subjected to a brutal sexual assault by the 5 men. During the ordeal, the perpetrators took photographs of the victim, threatening to release the images on social media should she report the crime. This act of intimidation was designed to instill fear and ensure her silence. The assault lasted for several harrowing minutes, after which the assailants fled, leaving the traumatized victims to fend for themselves. Despite the physical and emotional agony, the photojournalist and her colleague managed to reach a nearby hospital, where they received immediate medical attention. The incident was promptly reported to the police, setting off a chain of events that would lead to the apprehension of the culprits and a nationwide outcry against such heinous acts. In the aftermath of the assault, the Mumbai police launched an intensive investigation. Utilizing the descriptions provided by the victims, along with forensic evidence collected from the crime scene, the authorities were able to identify and apprehend the 5 perpetrators within a week. The swift action by law enforcement was met with widespread approval, but it also underscored the pressing need for systemic changes to prevent such incidents in the future. As the case proceeded to trial, it garnered extensive media coverage, sparking debates about women's safety, the role of law enforcement, and the societal attitudes that perpetuate such crimes. The Shakti Mills gang rape case became a catalyst for change, prompting both legislative reforms and a shift in public consciousness regarding issues of sexual violence and gender equality in India. The trial culminated in 2014, with the court delivering a landmark verdict that sought to send a strong message against such atrocities. The sentences handed down to the perpetrators were severe, reflecting the gravity of their crimes and the collective outrage of a society demanding justice. The case not only brought closure to the victims, but also ignited a movement aimed at creating a safer and more equitable environment for all. In the years following the incident, the Shakti Mills compound, once a symbol of industrial progress, stood as a stark reminder of the horrors that transpired within its walls. Efforts were made to rehabilitate the area, transforming it into a space that honors the resilience of survivors and serves as a testament to the ongoing fight against sexual violence. The legacy of the case continues to influence policies and societal attitudes, striving towards a future where such tragedies are relegated to history. The arrest of the 5 perpetrators in the Shakti Mills gang rape case was only the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. Mumbai police, under immense public pressure, ensured that no stone was left unturned in their investigation. In a city known for its resilience, the horrifying nature of this crime struck a deep nerve, igniting protests, discussions, and demands for swift justice. After the victim and her colleague reported the assault, police immediately launched a manhunt. The survivors' detailed testimony, along with the forensic evidence collected from the crime scene, played a crucial role in identifying the culprits. CCTV footage from surrounding areas also helped track the movements of the suspects, narrowing down their location. Within 72 hours, authorities had rounded up all 5 attackers. The juvenile suspect was apprehended first, and his confession led to the arrest of the others. During interrogation, the men showed no remorse. Initially, they attempted to deny any involvement, but when confronted with overwhelming evidence, including DNA samples collected from the crime scene and the victim's clothing, they had no choice but to confess. Their statements revealed a horrifying truth. This was not the first time they had committed such an atrocity. Just a month earlier, they had assaulted another woman in the same abandoned mill under eerily similar circumstances. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nation. The brutality of the crime, combined with the chilling realization that these men were repeat offenders, sparked massive outrage. Citizens took to the streets, demanding stricter laws and expedited trials for rape cases. The memory of the 2012 Delhi gang rape case was still fresh in the minds of many, and now, another horrific crime had unfolded in one of the country's biggest cities. The question arose, was India doing enough to protect its women? As the case moved to trial, the prosecution meticulously built its argument. The evidence was irrefutable. DNA samples linked the men directly to the crime, and their own admissions only cemented their guilt. The medical examination of the victim further corroborated the prosecution's case, detailing the injuries inflicted during the assault. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the mobile phone records of the accused. These records placed them at the crime scene during the time of the attack, eliminating any possibility of mistaken identity. The police also recovered photographs taken by the perpetrators during the assault, which they had used to blackmail their victims into silence. These images, found on the mobile phones of the accused, were presented in court, further proving their guilt. As the trial progressed, the victim's testimony became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. In a closed courtroom, she recounted the horrifying ordeal, her voice unwavering despite the trauma she had endured. Her courage in facing her attackers head-on was praised by activists, legal experts, and the general public. Meanwhile, the defense struggled to build a case. They attempted to argue that the confessions had been coerced, and that there was no direct witness to the crime apart from the victim and her colleague. However, the forensic evidence was overwhelming, and the judge quickly dismissed any claims of wrongful arrest. Public interest in the case remained high. Every hearing was followed closely by the media, and social activists continued to push for harsher punishments for sexual crimes. The case became a symbol of the larger battle against gender-based violence in India, highlighting the urgent need for systemic changes. Legal experts debated the appropriate punishment for the perpetrators. The 2013 Criminal Law Amendment Act, passed in response to the Delhi gang rape case, had introduced stricter penalties for sexual offenses, including the death penalty for repeat offenders. The Shakti Mills case became the first instance where this law would be tested. If found guilty, the perpetrators could face the harshest sentence possible under Indian law. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The families of the accused watched in silence, some in disbelief, others with tears in their eyes. Their sons, brothers, and husbands had committed an unthinkable crime, and now they were about to face the full force of the law. The victim, meanwhile, chose to remain out of the public eye. She had suffered immensely, yet she had shown remarkable strength. Despite the trauma, she had continued her career, refusing to let the crime define her life. Her resilience inspired many, turning her into a symbol of courage in the face of adversity. Finally, after months of hearings, the court was ready to deliver its verdict. The entire country waited with bated breath, hoping for justice, hoping that this time, the system would not fail. The Shakti Mills gang rape case had become more than just a trial. It had become a defining moment in India's fight against sexual violence. The final verdict in the Shakti Mills gang rape case came in early 2014, and it reverberated across the country. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge read out the sentences for each of the 5 accused. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as both supporters and critics of the legal system waited to hear the fate of the men who had so violently and brutally assaulted the photojournalist. Muhammad Qasim Hafiz Sheikh, Muhammad Salim Ansari, Vijay Jadhav, and Suraj Rahman Khan, along with the juvenile accomplice, were each found guilty of multiple charges, including rape, sexual assault, criminal intimidation, and kidnapping. The charges were not just about the brutality of the attack, but also about the depraved manner in which the men had manipulated and exploited the victims in order to carry out their horrific crime. The prosecution had argued that these men had shown no regard for the dignity of the victim or for the law, and had acted in a premeditated, violent manner. They had terrorized the victims not just physically, but psychologically as well, leaving them in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. What made the crime even more disturbing was the fact that the perpetrators had intended to force their victims into silence, using threats of releasing the photos of the assault on social media as leverage. The judge, in delivering the judgment, commented on the severity of the crime, stating that the assault was not only an attack on the physical well-being of the victim, but also an assault on the very fabric of society. The court also emphasized the failure of the accused to show any remorse or to seek redemption for their actions. The cold, calculated nature of the crime, combined with the cruelty they exhibited toward their victims, led the court to hand down a harsh sentence. Qasim, Ansari, Jadhav, and Khan were all sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This was a significant moment in India's legal history, as it represented the government's strong stance against those who commit such heinous crimes. The severity of the sentences was hailed by many as a signal that the justice system would no longer tolerate such violence, particularly against women. The juvenile offender, being under the age of 18 at the time of the crime, was tried separately under the Juvenile Justice Act. Despite the horrific nature of his involvement in the assault, the law treated him as a minor. He was sentenced to 3 years in a reform facility, a sentence that sparked considerable debate. Many felt that the law was too lenient given the severity of the crime, and critics of the juvenile justice system began calling for stricter measures in cases involving violent crimes committed by minors. The victim, despite the unimaginable trauma she had endured, showed an extraordinary level of courage throughout the proceedings. She had been forced to relive her nightmare during the trial, but her testimony remained unwavering, and her resolve to seek justice was inspiring. In her statement to the court, she said, "I am not a victim, I am a survivor," signaling that she would not allow the actions of these men to define the rest of her life. While the court's decision was a victory for the victims and their families, the case also highlighted the deep-rooted issues surrounding gender-based violence in India. The public outcry and protests that followed the Shakti Mills case were evidence that the country was at a crossroads. People demanded more than just punishment for the perpetrators. They wanted systemic changes that would ensure the safety of women in public and private spaces. Activists and human rights organizations rallied to raise awareness about the need for better protection for women. The Shakti Mills case ignited a renewed sense of urgency in the fight for stricter laws against sexual assault, as well as better enforcement of existing laws. In the wake of the verdict, the case spurred legal reforms. Indian authorities strengthened the laws surrounding sexual offenses, including enhancing penalties for those convicted of sexual violence. The country also took steps to improve the safety of women in public spaces, introducing measures like better street lighting, emergency helplines, and campaigns aimed at educating the public about consent and respect for women. The media coverage of the case also played a significant role in changing societal attitudes. News outlets and social media platforms used their influence to keep the conversation alive, highlighting the importance of consent, the rights of women, and the urgent need to end the culture of impunity surrounding sexual violence. However, despite these reforms and public awareness campaigns, the fight for women's safety in India remains an ongoing struggle. The Shakti Mills case was just one among many high-profile crimes, and while it spurred change, it also showed how much more work needed to be done. The conviction of the perpetrators was important, but it was only one small part of the larger challenge of creating a safer society for women. The victim's story, her bravery, and her refusal to be silenced became a beacon of hope for others facing similar hardships. In the years that followed, she continued to advocate for women's rights, becoming an outspoken figure in the fight against sexual violence. Her experience, though harrowing, ultimately became a source of strength for the growing movement calling for justice and reform. As for the Shakti Mills compound, the site of the crime became a symbol of both the horrors of sexual violence and the resilience of the survivors. Though the physical space was eventually demolished, its place in history as the backdrop to such a brutal crime is etched into the collective memory of the country. The Shakti Mills case, like many others before it, was a stark reminder that society must continue to challenge the deep-seated norms that enable gender violence to persist. It reinforced the need for stronger laws, better protection for victims, and a cultural shift towards greater respect and equality. It was a turning point, but the work to ensure a safer future for all women continued. Story 4. In 2013, a brutal and high-profile criminal case unfolded in the Philippines, revolving around Jason Ivler, a 28-year-old Filipino-American man with a troubled history. Born to a well-off businessman and a socialite mother, Ivler's life appeared promising on the surface. However, beneath the facade of privilege, he was known for his reckless behavior, violent tendencies, and numerous legal issues. His upbringing, once seen as a marker of success, could not shield him from the darker aspects of his personality. His history of violent confrontations and run-ins with the law eventually escalated to a series of horrific acts that would leave an indelible mark on the nation. Jason Ivler's criminal journey began with smaller offenses, but his life took a deadly turn in November 2012, when he became involved in a road rage incident that would claim the life of Renato Rene de Guzman, a government employee. The incident took place in Quezon City, a bustling part of Metro Manila, and quickly captured the attention of the public due to its senseless brutality. On the fateful day of November 18th, Ivler, driving a black Honda CR-V, got into a heated exchange with de Guzman while on the road. Ivler reportedly cut off de Guzman's vehicle, and after a brief confrontation between the two drivers, things escalated in an alarming way. Witnesses recall that Ivler, enraged by the disagreement, drew a firearm and shot de Guzman in cold blood. The scene was chilling, a man gunned down in broad daylight in front of his wife and children, a violent act that left de Guzman dead on the spot. After the shooting, Ivler sped off, leaving de Guzman's family behind, traumatized and in shock. The crime was both senseless and horrifying, sparking outrage across the country. What made it even more shocking was the speed with which Ivler fled the scene, vanishing into the city's dense neighborhoods. Despite being a known figure, he managed to evade the authorities for a while, further enraging the public and law enforcement. Ivler's escape only fueled the media frenzy surrounding the case. As the investigation began, it was clear that the authorities were dealing with a dangerous individual. Ivler had a reputation for violence, but what made him particularly menacing was his apparent disregard for human life, even in a situation that could have been resolved without bloodshed. The police launched an intensive manhunt to capture Ivler, knowing that he had a history of evading arrest. They quickly learned that Ivler had gone into hiding, but his whereabouts remained a mystery for several months. Despite the growing attention around his case, Ivler remained elusive, carefully evading capture by changing his location frequently and using his connections to avoid detection. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Ivler was not only responsible for the murder of de Guzman, but also for a series of other crimes. The authorities uncovered a pattern of violent behavior, including past instances of road rage and threats against other individuals. It was evident that Ivler had become a ticking time bomb, a dangerous individual whose disregard for the law and society had only intensified over the years. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, Ivler continued to elude capture, and his case became one of the most closely followed stories in the Philippines. The nation watched as the search for Ivler continued, with many speculating on how long he could keep his criminal activities hidden from the authorities. His wealthy background and connections had given him an advantage, but the law was closing in. Finally, in early 2013, a break in the case came. Ivler was located and arrested after a standoff with police. His capture marked the end of his brief but deadly crime spree, and the trial that followed would reveal the full extent of his violent actions. Ivler was charged with murder, as well as other related crimes, and his trial was closely followed by the public, eager to see justice served. During the trial, it became clear that Ivler was not only a dangerous criminal, but also a deeply disturbed individual, someone whose actions had been fueled by anger and a sense of entitlement. His defense team attempted to argue that Ivler had acted in self-defense, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the court found him guilty of the murder of Renato de Guzman. The case sparked a national conversation about road rage, violence, and the consequences of unchecked aggression. Ivler's trial brought to light the dangers of allowing anger and resentment to fester unchecked, and it served as a reminder of the fragile line between normalcy and violence. Ivler was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment, a verdict that many saw as just, considering the brutality of his actions. His case became an example of the dangers posed by individuals who, despite their privilege or family connections, could still commit heinous crimes. The murder of Renato de Guzman was senseless, and the loss felt by his family was immeasurable. But it also became a point of reflection for a society grappling with issues of violence, anger, and the need for stronger systems of justice to protect the public. As the country slowly came to terms with the shocking nature of the crime, Ivler's case remained in the public eye, and discussions about violence, mental health, and the role of privilege in criminal behavior continued. Though the case itself was closed, its impact on the collective consciousness of the Philippines was far from over. Following Jason Ivler's arrest, the legal proceedings and the subsequent media coverage captured the attention of the nation, with every development in the case closely followed by both the press and the public. His trial was seen not just as an attempt to bring justice for Renato de Guzman, but also as a test case for the broader issues of road rage and the consequences of unchecked violence in Philippine society. Ivler's background played a key role throughout the investigation and trial. Coming from an affluent and influential family, Ivler had been accustomed to a life of privilege. His father, a well-known businessman, and his mother, a respected socialite, had provided him with a life of luxury. However, this privilege seemed to have contributed to Ivler's sense of entitlement and a lack of accountability for his actions. Throughout his life, he had been allowed to skirt around the law, often using his family's connections to avoid serious consequences for his past violent behavior. As the trial unfolded, Ivler's defense team attempted to portray him as a victim of circumstance, arguing that his actions were a result of stress and external pressures. They even suggested that his behavior was a result of the complex relationship he had with his father, who was often absent from his life, leaving Ivler to navigate a turbulent upbringing largely on his own. But the public, and especially the family of Renato de Guzman, rejected these excuses. The prosecution painted a very different picture of Ivler. They described a man who had a long history of violent outbursts, and who had repeatedly used his anger as a tool for control. According to the prosecution, Ivler's road rage incident was not an isolated event, but part of a dangerous pattern of behavior. They argued that Ivler, when confronted with a minor traffic dispute, had reacted with such uncontrollable rage that he felt entitled to take the life of another person. His lack of remorse and his decision to flee the scene further proved that he did not view his actions as criminal, but as a natural response to perceived disrespect. Witnesses testified to Ivler's aggressive driving habits and his reckless behavior in the past. Friends, family members, and even strangers who had encountered him on the road shared stories of his tendency to escalate minor conflicts into dangerous confrontations. They recalled moments where Ivler had been verbally abusive and had threatened violence over trivial issues, often without provocation. This painted a picture of a man who was prone to aggression and violence, traits that would ultimately lead him to murder. One of the most harrowing pieces of evidence that came to light during the trial was a security camera recording of Ivler's vehicle shortly before the murder. The footage showed Ivler tailing de Guzman's car, a sign of his growing anger as the dispute escalated. The chilling moment when Ivler pulled out his gun and shot de Guzman in cold blood was captured in detail, leaving no doubt as to the intent and the brutality of the attack. The murder was premeditated, as Ivler had deliberately positioned himself behind de Guzman's vehicle and had planned to confront him in a violent manner. As the details of the murder were laid out before the court, it became clear that Ivler had not just taken the life of an innocent man, but had also deeply impacted the lives of de Guzman's family. De Guzman's wife, who had witnessed the shooting, spoke about the traumatic effect it had on her and their children. She recounted how the murder occurred in front of them, and how they had been forced to witness the senseless violence. Their lives were shattered, and the emotional scars they carried would never fade. De Guzman's young children were left without their father, and his wife had to cope with the aftermath of the loss while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her family. The emotional testimony from de Guzman's family had a profound impact on the court. It brought the reality of the crime into sharp focus, showing not just the physical loss of a loved one, but the emotional devastation caused by the senseless murder. The victim's family, in their testimony, emphasized that Ivler's actions were not just a reflection of his personal frustrations, but a violent crime that had destroyed a family. They asked for the harshest possible punishment to be handed down to Ivler, not just as a form of justice for their loss, but as a deterrent for anyone who might think of committing a similar crime. The media also played an instrumental role in keeping the case in the public eye. News outlets covered every aspect of the trial, from the shocking details of Ivler's crime to the emotional testimony from de Guzman's family. The coverage helped shape public opinion, with many Filipinos expressing anger at Ivler's apparent lack of remorse and his family's attempts to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Social media, in particular, became a platform for widespread outrage, as people demanded swift justice for de Guzman and his family. Despite the strong case presented by the prosecution, the defense persisted in its attempts to humanize Ivler. They claimed that he had struggled with mental health issues, such as anger management problems, and suggested that his violent tendencies were a result of personal difficulties. However, the court found these arguments unconvincing, particularly given the overwhelming evidence of Ivler's premeditated actions and his apparent disregard for the consequences of his crime. In the end, the trial culminated in a guilty verdict for Jason Ivler, and the court sentenced him to life imprisonment. The decision was met with relief by de Guzman's family and by the public, who felt that justice had been served. However, the case also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked aggression and the importance of accountability in a society that values law and order. Ivler's story did not end with the trial. His actions would forever be tied to the tragic death of Renato de Guzman, and his case would continue to spark discussions on the broader issues of violence, privilege, and the need for a more equitable legal system. While his imprisonment was seen as justice, the scars left on de Guzman's family and the community remained, a lasting reminder of the devastating consequences of violent behavior. Jason Ivler's conviction and subsequent sentencing marked the conclusion of a long and painful legal battle for the family of Renato de Guzman. But even though the legal proceedings had come to an end, the ripple effects of Ivler's crime would continue to reverberate throughout the nation. The brutal murder had raised serious questions about the increasing rate of violent crimes fueled by road rage, the culture of impunity that protected those in power, and the ability of individuals to escape justice due to their wealth and social status. The Philippines, like many countries, had seen road rage incidents become more frequent in recent years, but the murder of de Guzman brought this issue into sharp focus. It highlighted not just the dangers of aggressive driving, but also the underlying factors that could turn a simple dispute into something far more lethal. Ivler's case became a pivotal moment in the country's struggle with violence in public spaces. Public discourse quickly shifted to include calls for better laws to deal with road rage and harsher penalties for those who committed violent acts on the road. People demanded that the government take action to address these growing concerns. Proposals for stricter regulations on reckless driving and road rage incidents began to surface, and discussions were held about improving the legal system's response to such crimes. Activists and lawmakers alike called for more comprehensive measures, including compulsory anger management programs for repeat offenders and a nationwide campaign to raise awareness about the dangers of road rage. In the aftermath of Ivler's arrest and sentencing, there was a strong push for reforms in the criminal justice system. The case was seen by many as a glaring example of how privilege and wealth could influence the way justice was served. Ivler's ability to avoid capture for months, despite his high-profile crime, raised concerns about how some individuals with powerful connections could manipulate the system to their advantage. Many wondered if the case would have played out differently if Ivler had come from a less privileged background, and whether his family's status had allowed him to evade punishment for so long. For Ivler, the reality of life behind bars was an unimaginable shift from the life of luxury he had once known. His arrest had come at a great cost, and his trial had exposed the true extent of his violent tendencies. But even in prison, Ivler remained defiant. He made little effort to express remorse for his actions, maintaining that the murder was a result of his anger and frustration. His refusal to take responsibility for the crime only deepened the sense of injustice felt by de Guzman's family, who had been forced to relive the trauma of losing their loved one. Renato de Guzman's family, particularly his wife and children, faced an ongoing battle in their own right. While they found some solace in the conviction, the emotional scars from that day would never heal. De Guzman's wife had to navigate the overwhelming grief of losing her husband in such a violent manner, while also supporting their children, who had been forced to witness their father's murder. The trauma they had experienced that day was something that would haunt them for years to come, and the loss of a loving father and husband was a pain that would never truly fade. In the months following Ivler's conviction, the media continued to follow his case, but the focus began to shift to larger societal issues. The case sparked a renewed conversation about the need for a cultural shift in how society viewed anger, entitlement, and the treatment of others on the road. The media spotlight that had initially focused on Ivler as an individual criminal began to shine on the broader social and systemic issues that his crime had exposed. This collective reckoning led to several initiatives aimed at reducing road rage and improving public safety. Community organizations began organizing workshops and seminars to teach drivers about conflict resolution and the dangers of aggressive driving. The government introduced new traffic laws, including a stricter policy for dealing with road rage incidents. These initiatives were meant not only to address the symptoms of road violence, but also to challenge the underlying attitudes that allowed it to flourish. While Ivler's conviction was seen as a form of justice, it was clear that the case had uncovered much larger issues within the country. It wasn't just a question of punishing one individual. It was a question of addressing the broader culture of violence, entitlement, and impunity that could lead to such horrific acts. There was a growing understanding that solving one crime would not be enough to solve the problems that had allowed that crime to happen in the first place. For Ivler, life in prison was not just a consequence of his actions, but also a reflection of the larger issues at play. He had been a product of a system that had allowed him to live without consequences for years, and his crime had exposed the dangerous effects of that system. In prison, Ivler's life had become a stark contrast to the life he had once known. He had gone from a man of privilege to someone serving time for a heinous crime, and the isolation and loss were profound. The case of Jason Ivler and the murder of Renato de Guzman would remain a painful chapter in the history of the Philippines. It was a reminder of how unchecked anger and a sense of entitlement could lead to devastating consequences, and how important it was to address these issues before they escalated into violence. But it was also a story of resilience. The resilience of a family that had lost so much but had continued to fight for justice, and the resilience of a nation that had been forced to confront its own shortcomings in the face of such a senseless tragedy. In the years that followed, Ivler's case continued to serve as a catalyst for change, with many advocating for greater accountability and better support systems for families affected by violent crime. Though justice had been served for de Guzman, the work of healing, reform, and preventing future tragedies was far from over. And while Ivler's imprisonment marked the end of his freedom, it was just the beginning of the long road toward addressing the deep-rooted issues that had made his crime possible in the first place. Story 5. In 2013, a chilling crime rocked the quiet streets of Paris, France. The case involved the murder of a beloved elderly woman, known as Madame Juliette Dupont, who had lived in the heart of the city for over 60 years. What made this crime so shocking was not only its brutality, but also the identity of the perpetrator, a man by the name of Hugo Lemoyne. Hugo Lemoyne was a 32-year-old former student of philosophy who had struggled for years to find his place in the world. Born to middle-class parents in a small village in the French countryside, Hugo had always been somewhat of an outsider. His academic brilliance, while undeniable, was overshadowed by his social awkwardness and inability to connect with others. He spent much of his youth reading obscure philosophical texts, often retreating into his mind, and by his early 20s, Hugo had developed a deep sense of disillusionment with the world around him. His family, concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior, had tried to intervene, but Hugo's isolation only deepened. He moved to Paris with hopes of forging a new life, but instead, he spiraled further into depression and paranoia. Hugo's financial situation became dire when he failed to secure a stable job. Despite his intellectual prowess, he found little demand for a philosophy graduate with no practical skills. Struggling with his self-worth and consumed by feelings of anger and frustration, Hugo began to nurture dangerous ideas. He grew resentful of the wealthy, the well-off, and those who seemed to have everything he lacked. He became convinced that society was corrupt and that he, a misunderstood intellectual, was destined for something more significant than the life he was currently living. These dark thoughts took root, and over time, they transformed into a desire for revenge against the world that had rejected him. Madame Juliette Dupont, the victim, was a retired schoolteacher who had spent the final years of her life in a modest but cozy apartment on Rue de la Paix. She had lived a quiet, peaceful life, enjoying her daily walks through the streets of Paris, often stopping to chat with the locals. Known for her warm smile and kind heart, Madame Dupont had been a staple in her community. She was a beloved figure, well respected by her neighbors and friends. Despite her age, she was independent and lived alone, having lost her husband many years prior. Her life, though humble, was one of contentment. But unbeknownst to her, a man with a tormented mind was watching from the shadows, and her peaceful existence was about to come to a tragic end. It was in the early hours of the morning on October 15, 2013, when the crime occurred. Hugo Lemoyne had been planning the murder for weeks, methodically choosing his victim with cold precision. He had seen Madame Dupont many times before, walking her dog in the park or shopping at the local market. He had come to believe that she represented everything that was wrong with the world, a symbol of the comfortable, the content, and the happy. He saw her as someone who had lived a life of privilege, never experiencing the hardships he had faced. In his warped mind, she had become the perfect target for his anger and frustration. That morning, Hugo, wearing a black hooded jacket to conceal his identity, waited outside Madame Dupont's apartment building. He had watched her for days, learning her routine and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When she left her apartment to run errands, Hugo followed her at a distance, feeling a sense of purpose. As she entered a local bakery, Hugo approached her from behind and, without warning, grabbed her by the arm and forced her into a nearby alley. The attack was swift and brutal. Hugo, driven by a combination of rage and delusion, assaulted Madame Dupont with a knife he had purchased earlier that week. The elderly woman, though frail and unprepared for the attack, fought back, but Hugo was relentless. In a matter of moments, he had fatally wounded her, leaving her body abandoned in the alley where she had taken her final breath. Hugo's actions were calculated, but the shock of the murder soon turned into confusion as he stood over her body, paralyzed by what he had just done. For a moment, he had a brief flash of realization, wondering if he had truly accomplished something meaningful, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of emptiness. He fled the scene almost immediately, leaving behind the evidence of his crime, including the knife that he had used. His hands shook as he hurriedly disposed of his clothes in a nearby trash bin and disappeared into the streets of Paris. The murder was initially a mystery. Madame Dupont's neighbors, alarmed by her absence, called the police, and soon, investigators began piecing together the details of the crime. The scene where the body was found was eerily quiet, with no signs of a struggle or a clear motive. As the investigation progressed, detectives found no immediate links between the victim and any known criminals or adversaries, leaving them baffled. The only clue they had was the surveillance footage from nearby security cameras, which captured a figure leaving the scene in a hurry. Though the footage was grainy, it was enough to spark a breakthrough in the case. Days passed, and the investigation into Madame Dupont's murder intensified. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents and trying to piece together any information that might help them find the killer. Hugo, meanwhile, attempted to lay low, avoiding the public eye as much as possible, but his behavior began to raise suspicions. Neighbors who had seen him around town reported that he had become increasingly agitated in the weeks leading up to the murder, often muttering to himself or engaging in strange, erratic conversations. His former friends recalled his growing obsession with philosophy and his increasingly nihilistic outlook on life. They described him as someone who had grown more withdrawn to the point of madness. As the evidence began to mount, Hugo's past came under scrutiny. Investigators uncovered details about his troubled history, including his failed attempts to find work and his feelings of alienation. His social media accounts revealed his deep resentment toward society and his often cryptic posts about revolution and the corrupt nature of the world. In interviews with family members, it became clear that Hugo had been battling mental health issues for years, though he had refused to seek help. His increasingly erratic behavior had caused concern among those close to him, but no one had suspected that he was capable of such violence. After several weeks of investigation, Hugo Lemoine was arrested. The police tracked him down to a small apartment in the outskirts of Paris, where he had been hiding in plain sight. When he was confronted with the evidence, he showed no remorse, his cold demeanor offering no explanation for his actions. The investigation had confirmed that Hugo had carefully planned the murder, targeting Madame Dupont because of his warped beliefs about society and his misplaced sense of injustice. To him, the crime had been an act of revolution, a way to make a statement about the world that had never understood him. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the murder of Madame Dupont was not just an isolated act of violence, but the culmination of years of mental turmoil, alienation, and frustration. Hugo Lemoine's crime would go down as one of the most shocking in recent Parisian history, a tragedy that would forever alter the lives of those who had known Madame Dupont and spark a national conversation about mental health, societal alienation, and the consequences of untreated psychological distress. The arrest of Hugo Lemoine shook Paris to its core, and the investigation into the murder of Madame Juliette Dupont became a focal point for discussions about mental health, violence, and the undercurrents of disillusionment within society. As the details of Hugo's troubled past came to light, the public and the media began to focus not just on the shocking nature of the crime, but on the factors that had driven him to such extremes. How could someone who appeared so unassuming, so intellectual, and so withdrawn turn into a brutal killer? In the days following Hugo's arrest, detectives began to uncover more about his life and the trajectory that led him to commit such a heinous act. His childhood, marked by social isolation, had been a key factor in his emotional development. Raised in a small rural village, Hugo had always been an outsider. Despite his academic success in school, he had never been able to connect with his peers. His obsession with philosophy, while intellectually impressive, further alienated him from others. His family, while loving, struggled to understand his inner turmoil. They hoped that his intellectual pursuits would lead him to a meaningful career, but as Hugo grew older, his sense of purpose became increasingly unclear. Hugo's transition from a bright student to a troubled adult was gradual but unmistakable. His lack of direction led to periods of severe depression, and he often withdrew into himself, distancing himself from family and friends. His attempts to forge a career were met with failure, and his increasing inability to relate to those around him made it impossible for him to find lasting employment. At times, Hugo would express grandiose ideas about changing the world or making a profound impact on society, but these thoughts were never followed by concrete actions. He had become trapped in a cycle of frustration, bitterness, and self-pity. By the time he moved to Paris in his late 20s, Hugo's life had reached a breaking point. The city, with all its intellectualism and culture, offered little solace. He sought refuge in his academic pursuits, diving deeper into the works of Nietzsche, Camus, and other existential philosophers who questioned the meaning of life. But these readings only seemed to reinforce his sense of disillusionment. He saw the world as meaningless, filled with hypocrisy and corruption. In his mind, he was a misunderstood intellectual, and the ordinary people around him were mere pawns in a system they didn't understand. Paris, once a beacon of hope for him, had turned into a cold, uncaring place where his isolation was more palpable than ever. As his isolation deepened, Hugo's mental health deteriorated. He began to fixate on the idea that society had wronged him, that the comfortable lives of others, like Madame Dupont, were a symbol of everything he could never attain. He came to see his target as a representation of the very system that had rejected him. To Hugo, Madame Dupont, with her gentle demeanor and predictable life, was the perfect embodiment of the complacency and privilege that he resented. In his mind, killing her would somehow wake up the world to the injustices he had suffered, even though it was clear to those around him that his delusions were far from reality. Hugo's behavior had become increasingly erratic in the months leading up to the murder. Neighbors recalled seeing him pacing the streets at odd hours, talking to himself or staring blankly into the distance. He became known in his building as the quiet, brooding man who kept to himself, never engaging with others unless absolutely necessary. His attempts to communicate with people were awkward and often tinged with a sense of superiority. He looked down on those around him, dismissing them as simple-minded and beneath him. These feelings were not expressed openly, but they simmered beneath the surface, fueling his growing rage. Hugo's anger was not directed solely at the world around him, but at himself as well. He was consumed by a sense of failure, frustrated by his inability to achieve the greatness he believed he deserved. The quiet streets of Paris, which he had once seen as a refuge for intellectuals and artists, now seemed to mock him. He would walk past the cafes and bookshops, watching the people around him live their lives with ease, and he felt an increasing sense of alienation. Hugo's anger festered, and his thoughts turned darker, more violent. He became obsessed with the idea of correcting the injustices of the world, but his twisted interpretation of justice led him down a dangerous path. The night before the murder, Hugo sat in his apartment, stewing over his thoughts. He had planned the attack meticulously, but in a detached, almost clinical way. He was not driven by a sudden surge of passion, but by a cold, calculating desire to make a statement. The choice of Madame Dupont as his victim was no accident. He had observed her for weeks, watching her daily routines, learning her habits, and mentally preparing for the moment when he would confront her. He had convinced himself that her death would be a way to bring meaning to his existence, a way to strike at the heart of the world that had rejected him. When he finally left his apartment to execute his plan, Hugo's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had convinced himself that he was justified in his actions, that he was the victim of an unjust society, and that Madame Dupont represented everything he despised. But as he followed her, he felt a sense of detachment, as if he were watching someone else commit the crime. When the moment came, and he confronted her in the alley, Hugo was already numb to the consequences of his actions. The brief encounter, which lasted only a few minutes, was enough to shatter any semblance of normality in his life. After the murder, Hugo's initial shock quickly turned to regret, but not in the way one might expect. Rather than remorse for taking an innocent life, he was more concerned with the realization that the act had not brought him the catharsis he had imagined. His life, despite the murder, remained as empty and purposeless as before. There was no sense of validation, no great philosophical breakthrough. Instead, Hugo was left with the unsettling feeling that his crime had been nothing more than a futile attempt to assert control over a world he could not comprehend. The investigation, which initially seemed to be at a dead end, picked up steam when the authorities began to connect the dots between Hugo's isolated life and the crime. His obsessive behavior, his fascination with philosophy, and his disdain for society painted a portrait of a man who had spiraled into madness. As investigators pieced together his movements, they realized that Hugo had been planning the murder for far longer than they had initially thought. The arrest of Hugo Lemoyne sent shockwaves throughout Paris, and as the story of the murder unfolded in the media, it became clear that the case was not just about one man's descent into violence. It was about a larger issue, the growing disillusionment and alienation in modern society. Hugo's crime served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked mental illness, the importance of early intervention, and the need for greater attention to the psychological well-being of those who, like Hugo, fall through the cracks. The murder of Madame Dupont was not just an isolated tragedy. It was a reflection of the deep societal issues that still needed to be addressed. As Hugo Lemoyne's trial approached, the case began to receive widespread media attention across France and beyond. The shocking nature of the crime, an intellectually driven, premeditated murder of a beloved, elderly woman, raised uncomfortable questions about society's role in shaping individuals and the invisible forces that could push a person to the brink of violence. The more people learned about Hugo's life, the more it seemed as though he had been a product of a system that failed to nurture him, providing neither the emotional support nor the social connections necessary for a young man to thrive. Hugo's defense team initially tried to argue that his mental state had been severely compromised by years of untreated psychological issues, asserting that his capacity for judgment had been clouded by delusions and the belief that he was a misunderstood intellectual in a society that had no place for him. They attempted to paint him as a tragic figure, a person who had suffered from alienation and mental illness, and who had ultimately committed the murder as an expression of frustration with the world around him. The defense highlighted Hugo's isolated upbringing in the French countryside, his sense of failure after years of academic pursuits, and his inability to form meaningful relationships. They argued that these factors, combined with his obsession with existential philosophy, had created a perfect storm of disillusionment that led to his act of violence. However, the prosecution presented a different view. They argued that Hugo, despite his mental health struggles, was not acting in a state of temporary insanity. They painted him as a cold and calculating individual who had carefully planned the murder, demonstrating a level of forethought and detachment that suggested he was fully aware of what he was doing. They noted that Hugo had studied his victim for weeks, learning her routine and carefully choosing the moment to strike. The prosecution also pointed to his behavior after the murder, his immediate flight from the scene, his attempt to erase any trace of the crime, and his lack of remorse, as evidence that Hugo was not motivated by a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather by a deep, unshakable belief in the righteousness of his actions. The media coverage surrounding the trial was extensive, with pundits and commentators from all corners of society offering their opinions on Hugo's motivations and the larger implications of the case. Some saw him as a product of a broken society, where individuals who are not able to meet its expectations are often left behind, marginalized and forgotten. Others viewed him as a dangerous and delusional individual who had used his intellectual pursuits as a mask for his growing hatred of the world. The case sparked debates about the role of mental health services in society, the pressures placed on young people, and the ways in which intellectualism could be misused to justify harmful actions. Meanwhile, Hugo's family struggled to comprehend the man their son had become. His parents, who had tried to support him throughout his life, were devastated by the turn of events. They had always hoped that his intellectual pursuits would lead him to a fulfilling career, and they were bewildered by the transformation he had undergone. In interviews, they expressed shock and disbelief at the crime, describing Hugo as someone who had been sensitive and thoughtful in his youth, but who had grown increasingly withdrawn and bitter over the years. His mother, in particular, struggled to reconcile the child she had raised with the man who had taken Madame Dupont's life. She spoke about the despair she felt after realizing that she had not been able to help him, that his inner turmoil had been so profound that no amount of love or support could have prevented the tragedy. Hugo's trial lasted several months, with each new development in the case revealing more about the complexities of his mind and the depth of his disillusionment. As the defense team called expert witnesses to testify about Hugo's mental state, it became clear that he had suffered from depression for many years, and that his detachment from reality had only deepened over time. Some psychologists suggested that his obsession with philosophy and his tendency to overthink had contributed to his inability to process his emotions in a healthy way, leading him to develop a distorted worldview. He had come to believe that life had no inherent meaning, and that those who found happiness or fulfillment were simply deluded by society's false promises. To Hugo, the act of killing Madame Dupont was not one of hatred but an act of liberation, an attempt to break free from the confines of a society that had, in his eyes, abandoned him. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury ultimately found Hugo Lemoine guilty of first-degree murder. The court concluded that while Hugo had indeed struggled with severe mental health issues, his actions were still premeditated and deliberate. They acknowledged that his intellectual pursuits and his isolation had played a role in shaping his worldview, but they also emphasized that he had made a conscious decision to end Madame Dupont's life. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some people felt sympathy for Hugo, believing that his actions were the result of a deep and unresolved personal crisis. Others were appalled by his lack of remorse and the coldness with which he had carried out the murder. The victim's family and friends expressed their heartbreak at the senseless loss of a kind, loving woman, and they called for greater awareness of the need for mental health support in society. In the aftermath of the trial, discussions about Hugo's crime continued to dominate public discourse. Experts debated the role of philosophy and intellectualism in shaping one's worldview, with some arguing that it could provide a useful framework for understanding the world, while others warned that it could lead individuals down dangerous paths if not balanced with a sense of empathy and connection to others. The case also raised important questions about the state of mental health services in France, and whether more could have been done to intervene in Hugo's life before he became a danger to others. Many people, particularly those who had suffered from mental health issues themselves, expressed frustration that the system had failed to provide Hugo with the help he so desperately needed. Hugo Lemoyne's sentence was ultimately handed down in 2014, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he remained eerily calm, his face unreadable. He had shown no emotion throughout the trial, and even after his conviction, he seemed detached, as if the verdict meant little to him. In prison, Hugo continued to engage with philosophy, reading books and writing in his journal, though he was said to have become more withdrawn and introspective over time. The murder of Madame Juliette Dupont remained a tragic reminder of the fragility of human life, the hidden struggles that many face, and the dangers of unchecked isolation. Though justice had been served, the case continued to raise difficult questions about society's responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members and the consequences of neglecting those in need of support. For those who knew Madame Dupont, the memory of her gentle nature lived on, even as Hugo's tragic story unfolded as a dark chapter in the history of a city known for its intellectual vibrancy and cultural richness. Story 6. In 2013, Europe was shaken by the criminal case involving a man named Martin Norgard, a 32-year-old Danish citizen who had been living in the quiet town of Odense on the island of Funen, Denmark. Martin was a former soldier who had served in the Danish military for several years. He was a man who had been widely regarded by his friends and colleagues as quiet, introverted, and seemingly stable, though there had been whispers about his struggles with mental health after his military service. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Martin's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He had recently returned from a deployment overseas, where he had witnessed intense combat. The trauma from his experiences seemed to linger, and Martin began to isolate himself. He withdrew from friends, stopped attending therapy sessions, and spent most of his time at home. Those closest to him noticed subtle changes, his mood swings, his occasional bursts of anger, and his inability to focus. However, no one suspected the depth of his inner turmoil or the devastating event that was about to unfold. On a cold, winter evening in late November 2013, Martin Norgard committed a brutal murder that would send shockwaves through the small Danish community. His victim was his former girlfriend, 28-year-old Emma Peterson, a young woman who had recently ended their tumultuous relationship. The two had met several years prior and had shared a passionate, albeit volatile, romance. Emma had struggled to reconcile Martin's increasingly unpredictable behavior with the love she once felt for him, and eventually, she decided to end the relationship for good. For Martin, this breakup was the final blow. He had been unable to cope with the loss of Emma, and the emotional pain he felt triggered a violent outburst that would change the course of both their lives. Despite his isolation, Martin had remained fixated on Emma, and he believed that her decision to leave him was a personal rejection, something he couldn't come to terms with. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and abandoned. In his mind, Emma had not just broken up with him. She had taken away the one thing that had given his life meaning, and he was determined to make her feel the same sense of pain and hopelessness that he did. On the night of the murder, Martin showed up unannounced at Emma's apartment. He had been drinking heavily and was in a state of emotional turmoil. He rang the doorbell multiple times, but Emma, who had been warned by friends about Martin's erratic behavior, refused to let him in. Martin's pleas grew louder, his frustration mounting with each passing moment. He demanded to see her, to talk to her one last time, but Emma remained firm in her decision to end the relationship. In his rage, Martin broke into the apartment. What followed was a confrontation that turned violent. Emma screamed for help as Martin, in a fit of fury, attacked her. The details of the assault were gruesome, with Emma's cries echoing through the walls of the apartment building. When the police arrived, they found Emma's lifeless body on the floor, her injuries consistent with a brutal struggle. Martin had fled the scene by the time law enforcement arrived, but his fingerprints were found on several surfaces in the apartment, and neighbors reported hearing his angry shouts moments before the attack. The investigation into Emma's death began quickly, with police piecing together the timeline of events. They discovered that Martin had been seen near Emma's apartment in the hours leading up to the murder, and witnesses reported hearing a commotion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but Martin was nowhere to be found. For days, authorities launched a manhunt across Odense, hoping to apprehend him before he could escape the country. It wasn't until a week later that Martin was finally located in a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. He had been hiding there, disheveled and unwell, barely eating or drinking. When he was arrested, Martin was in a state of shock, his eyes vacant and distant. He was immediately taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. As he was questioned by the police, he remained silent, offering no explanation for his actions. It was clear that his emotional and mental state had been severely compromised, but whether or not this would be enough to mitigate his responsibility for the murder was yet to be determined. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Martin's time in the military had left deep psychological scars. Those who knew him during his service described him as a model soldier, someone who was disciplined and strong, but who had struggled to adjust to civilian life after returning from deployment. He had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after witnessing several traumatic events during his service, but he had been reluctant to seek help. His struggles with mental health had worsened over time, and many felt that the military, despite recognizing his condition, had not done enough to address it. The relationship between Martin and Emma had always been troubled, but it had become increasingly unstable after his return from deployment. Emma had expressed concern about Martin's mood swings and his inability to control his anger, but she had hoped that with time, he would heal. She had even encouraged him to seek therapy, but Martin had refused, believing that he could handle his issues on his own. His growing isolation, coupled with the emotional fallout from their breakup, seemed to push him over the edge, leading to the tragic events of that fateful night. The trial of Martin Norgard began in the spring of 2014, and it was one of the most widely publicized cases in Denmark that year. Martin's defense team argued that his actions had been influenced by his untreated PTSD, which had led to a temporary loss of control over his emotions and impulses. They contended that Martin had not intended to kill Emma, but rather, his violent outburst had been a result of his deteriorating mental state. The prosecution, on the other hand, emphasized the premeditation involved in the crime. They noted that Martin had planned the attack and had been obsessively focused on Emma, even after their breakup. His decision to show up at her apartment uninvited, despite her clear intentions to end the relationship, was seen as a deliberate act of coercion and intimidation. The prosecution argued that Martin had been fully aware of his actions, and that the murder was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather the result of a dangerous and escalating pattern of behavior. As the trial progressed, the court heard from several experts in psychology and military trauma, who testified about the effects of PTSD on individuals and the potential for violent outbursts. Some witnesses described Martin as a victim of a system that had failed to provide him with the support he needed, while others emphasized the responsibility he bore for his actions, regardless of his mental health struggles. The jury deliberated for several days before reaching a verdict. In the end, Martin Norgard was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some felt that the sentence was too lenient, given the brutal nature of the crime, while others believed that Martin's mental health issues should have been given more consideration. For Emma's family and friends, the conviction did little to ease the pain of losing a loved one. They described her as a bright and compassionate woman who had so much life ahead of her, and they felt that her death could have been prevented if only Martin had received the help he needed. In the years that followed, Martin Norgard remained in prison, undergoing therapy and treatment for his PTSD. While many believed that his actions were the result of a deep psychological crisis, others remained unconvinced, feeling that the murder had been the result of a man's inability to cope with rejection and emotional pain. The case highlighted the complex intersection of mental health, trauma, and violence, and it sparked ongoing debates about the adequacy of support systems for veterans and individuals with PTSD. As the investigation into Emma's death unfolded, the more the authorities and the public learned about Martin Norgard, the more disturbing the picture became. His life, which had once seemed to follow a predictable trajectory, was now shrouded in a pattern of troubling behavior that only became apparent after the murder. For those who had known him before, it was difficult to reconcile the quiet, reserved man they once admired with the violent killer who had taken Emma's life. The question lingered: how had he descended so deeply into emotional turmoil? And was there any way to have prevented the tragedy? The police began to piece together Martin's past, uncovering the toll that his military service had taken on him. Martin's time in the Danish military had initially appeared to be a period of stability and achievement. He had excelled in his training and had earned the respect of his colleagues. But it was only after his deployment to conflict zones that his demeanor began to change. Witnesses from his time in the military spoke of a man who had once been enthusiastic and driven, but who had gradually become withdrawn, increasingly irritable, and emotionally distant. His mental health struggles had started to manifest shortly after his return from overseas. He began to have trouble sleeping, often waking up in a cold sweat from nightmares of combat. His mood would swing erratically, and he found it difficult to engage with others. He also became more prone to anger, and his ability to control his emotions began to deteriorate. At first, Martin tried to cope with these changes on his own, refusing to acknowledge that he needed help. He would brush off concerns from his family and friends, insisting that he was fine and that he just needed time to adjust. But deep inside, he was drowning, and the weight of his experiences in war took a heavy toll on his psyche. Emma, who had been supportive of him during their relationship, had noticed these changes and tried to help. She encouraged Martin to seek therapy, urging him to talk to a professional about his struggles. But Martin resisted, dismissing the idea as unnecessary. He believed that seeking therapy was a sign of weakness, and instead, he turned inward, allowing the anger and sadness to fester. As the months passed, their relationship became increasingly strained. Emma felt that she was walking on eggshells, never sure which version of Martin she would encounter. Was it the kind, thoughtful man she had once fallen in love with, or the emotionally volatile person who seemed incapable of processing his pain? The relationship reached a breaking point when Emma finally made the decision to end it. She had hoped that this would give Martin the space he needed to heal and get help, but she had also reached a point where her own emotional well-being had become a priority. She had spent months trying to support him, but it was clear that her efforts were in vain. Martin, however, was devastated by the breakup. He could not accept her decision and began to fixate on the idea that she had rejected him completely. His emotional instability, combined with the trauma from his military service, created a perfect storm of resentment and rage. He could not understand why Emma was abandoning him, and in his mind, her rejection was a personal affront. The anger he had suppressed for so long was now channeled into a singular obsession, making Emma feel the same level of pain that he was experiencing. Emma had become fearful of Martin's increasingly erratic behavior. She had been receiving late-night phone calls from him, some of which were filled with angry rants, while others were full of desperate pleas for reconciliation. She had told her friends and family that she felt unsafe, and they had urged her to take further precautions. Yet, despite her efforts to distance herself from Martin, he continued to show up at her door, uninvited and unpredictable. On the evening of the murder, Emma had planned to spend the night with a close friend, but Martin's persistence would not allow her to escape. When he arrived at her apartment, he was visibly intoxicated, his eyes wild with emotion. Emma's refusal to let him in only seemed to escalate his anger. His repeated knocking on the door was met with silence, but he refused to give up. Then, in a moment of fury, Martin smashed a window to gain entry. His mind was clouded with rage, his vision narrowed by the belief that Emma was his only source of relief from the pain of his shattered life. It was then that the situation spiraled into violence. The ensuing confrontation was both tragic and horrifying. The neighbors who lived in the building recalled hearing the sounds of shouting and crashing furniture as the altercation intensified. One neighbor later testified that they had heard Emma's terrified screams for help, but by the time they reached her apartment, it was too late. They could not have known just how horrific the scene would be when they opened the door. By the time the police arrived at the scene, Martin had fled, leaving behind only the bloody aftermath of his crime. The evidence was irrefutable. Emma had been brutally assaulted, her injuries suggesting a violent struggle for her life. The authorities immediately launched an investigation, but they knew that their prime suspect was Martin Norgard, as he had been seen leaving the building just moments after the attack. His fingerprints were found on the broken window, and his DNA was found at the scene. The police were able to trace his movements through security camera footage, which confirmed his presence near Emma's apartment shortly before the murder. For several days, Martin was a fugitive. His whereabouts were unknown, and authorities feared that he might attempt to flee the country. As the days wore on, police intensified their search. The media caught wind of the case, and news outlets across Denmark began reporting on the murder and the manhunt for Martin Norgard. The country was captivated by the tragic story of a man whose life had once held promise, but who had spiraled into violence as a result of untreated trauma and emotional turmoil. It wasn't until a week later that Martin was apprehended. He had been hiding in a small, isolated cabin in the outskirts of Odense, living in squalor, disoriented and barely coherent. When the police finally found him, he did not resist arrest. Instead, he appeared to be in a state of shock, as though the reality of what he had done had not fully sunk in. He was taken into custody without incident, and upon his arrest, he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital for a thorough evaluation. The psychological evaluation revealed that Martin had suffered from significant post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a result of his military service, and that his emotional breakdown was a key factor in the events that had unfolded. Experts testified that while PTSD was an undeniable factor in Martin's state of mind, it was not an excuse for his actions. He had made a deliberate choice to confront Emma, and the violent assault had been premeditated in nature. The psychological reports painted a portrait of a man who had been deeply scarred by his experiences, but who had also failed to acknowledge or seek treatment for his mental health struggles. The military's failure to address his PTSD, combined with his emotional instability, had created a dangerous mix. Martin's actions, while deeply influenced by his psychological state, were ultimately his responsibility. He was not the victim, despite the suffering he had endured during his service. Instead, it was Emma, a woman who had simply tried to end an unhealthy relationship, who had paid the ultimate price. The trial of Martin Norgard was a somber and emotional event, drawing attention to the complex issues surrounding mental health, PTSD, and the responsibility of individuals to take ownership of their actions. The court heard from both the defense and the prosecution, with experts testifying about the role of trauma in shaping behavior and the consequences of untreated mental health issues. The public was divided in their opinions. Some felt that Martin should receive a lighter sentence due to his mental health struggles, while others believed that the brutal nature of the crime demanded a harsh punishment. Ultimately, Martin Norgard was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The verdict was met with mixed reactions, but for Emma's family and friends, it was a bittersweet conclusion to a tragedy that had claimed the life of a beloved woman. The case left many questioning the adequacy of the systems in place to support veterans dealing with PTSD and the devastating consequences of ignoring the signs of mental health struggles. In the aftermath of the trial, the case of Martin Norgard and the death of Emma Peterson continued to spark intense debate throughout Denmark and across Europe. Many were left grappling with the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues, especially for military personnel who had been exposed to trauma in the line of duty. While some argued that Martin's PTSD had played a significant role in his actions, others felt that he had chosen to embrace the path of violence rather than seek the help he so desperately needed. In the years following his conviction, Martin's case remained a focal point for discussions about mental health care for veterans. Advocates for mental health reform pointed to Martin's situation as an example of how the system had failed him. They highlighted the lack of adequate mental health services available to veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Despite his obvious struggles, Martin had been unable to access the care that might have prevented the tragedy. Many felt that he had been let down by the very institutions that were supposed to support him. This case drew attention to the gaps in support for soldiers returning from conflict zones, who often struggled with invisible wounds that were not as easily recognized or understood as physical injuries. For Martin, life in prison was a brutal wake-up call. In the years since his conviction, he had begun a slow and painful journey towards self-awareness and understanding. He was enrolled in therapy sessions designed to help him confront the trauma of his military service and the emotional damage he had caused. Over time, Martin began to admit that while his PTSD had exacerbated his actions, it had not been the sole reason for the crime. He had made a choice. He had chosen to let his emotions overpower him, rather than taking the necessary steps to heal. He admitted to himself and to his counselors that his deep feelings of betrayal, humiliation, and anger had clouded his judgment to the point where he was unable to see the human being he was hurting. Emma, the woman he had once loved. While he had never fully reconciled with the horror of what he had done, Martin expressed remorse for the pain he caused to Emma's family, her friends, and his own. He became more open during his therapy sessions, allowing himself to feel the guilt and sadness that had previously been buried under layers of anger. He also began to reflect on how his military experience had shaped his view of the world. Martin had been trained to deal with violence, to fight and survive, but he had never learned how to process the emotions that came with it. He had never been taught how to handle grief, loss, or rejection. The skills needed to navigate those emotions had been missing from his training, and they were not something he had learned to manage as he left the battlefield for civilian life. The only thing he had known was that when confronted with overwhelming feelings, he reacted with anger, a reaction that had now cost him everything. Despite his remorse, Martin's time in prison was not without difficulty. He struggled with loneliness, isolation, and the constant weight of the murder he had committed. His mental health continued to be fragile, and he often found himself in dark, reflective moods. At times, he questioned whether he was deserving of redemption, especially in light of the irreversible damage he had caused. The guilt was overwhelming, but he understood that there was no way to undo the past. All he could do now was work to rebuild his life, one step at a time, and hope that one day, perhaps, he could contribute something positive to society, though he knew that would not erase the pain he had caused. Emma's family, on the other hand, continued to grieve her death. Her parents, who had hoped for a future with their daughter, were left with an emptiness that could never be filled. Emma had been a bright and promising young woman, full of potential. She had dreams, plans, and a future ahead of her, but Martin's actions had robbed her of that. They never got the closure they needed, never received an explanation that made sense to them. They were left with the haunting question of how someone they had known, someone they had trusted, could become capable of such violence. In the years after her death, Emma's family kept her memory alive, sharing stories about her, celebrating her accomplishments, and mourning the life she should have had. The case also had an enduring impact on Denmark's broader community. It led to significant conversations about how society could better support individuals grappling with the psychological aftermath of war. In the wake of the tragedy, a coalition of mental health advocates pushed for expanded resources for veterans and better access to psychological support for those returning from conflict zones. The Danish military began to re-evaluate its protocols for mental health assessments, and several initiatives were launched to address the needs of soldiers suffering from PTSD and other related conditions. Yet, despite these efforts, the challenges continued. Many veterans still found themselves without adequate care, and the stigma surrounding mental health issues remained a barrier to seeking help. The cultural expectations that soldiers should remain tough, stoic, and unyielding in the face of adversity made it difficult for many to acknowledge the mental toll their experiences had taken. Some soldiers continued to view therapy and counseling as weaknesses rather than necessary tools for healing. Meanwhile, the public outcry over Martin's actions had subsided, but the pain of his crime remained fresh for those who had been personally affected. Emma's friends, who had stood by her during her relationship with Martin, struggled to understand how they had missed the signs of his emotional instability. They blamed themselves for not doing more to intervene, even though they had tried to help her. They had urged Emma to end the relationship, but they hadn't known the full extent of Martin's behavior or the extent of his emotional breakdown. They were left with an overwhelming sense of guilt, even though they had done their best to protect their friend. Despite all the pain, the case left behind a legacy that transcended the tragedy itself. It served as a painful but necessary reminder of the impact of untreated mental illness and the importance of providing support to those who are struggling. It underscored the need for greater awareness about PTSD and its potential consequences, especially for those who had served in military conflicts. And it highlighted the need for a system that was better equipped to address mental health issues, not just during active duty, but also after service when the scars of war remained long after the battles had ended. As the years passed, Martin's story became one of caution, a chilling reminder that the invisible wounds of war can have devastating effects if left unchecked. While the court had made its decision, the questions about responsibility, mental health, and forgiveness would continue to linger in the minds of many, forcing society to look more deeply at how it can prevent such tragedies from happening again. Story 7. In 2014, Australia was shaken by the brutal murder of a young woman named Sarah Collins. The perpetrator, Matthew Smith, was a 32-year-old man with a dark history of substance abuse and violent outbursts. At the time of the crime, he had been living in Melbourne and had become known among his friends and family for his increasingly erratic behavior. Matthew had a history of mental health issues, but his struggles with addiction and anger management were far more public. Despite his issues, he had somehow managed to maintain a semblance of normalcy, holding down a job as a carpenter, though his personal life was in turmoil. Matthew's relationship with Sarah was turbulent from the start. They had met a year prior at a mutual friend's party, and what had seemed like a promising connection quickly devolved into something unhealthy. Sarah, a 26-year-old university student studying sociology, had been drawn to Matthew's charm and ruggedness, but she had no idea of the dark side that lay beneath his exterior. Matthew, on the other hand, was captivated by Sarah's intelligence and beauty, but found himself unable to cope with his own insecurities and emotional instability. Their relationship was marked by emotional manipulation, controlling behavior, and at times physical altercations. It wasn't long before Sarah began to realize that Matthew's behavior was becoming more erratic. His struggles with alcohol and drugs seemed to escalate, and he became possessive, jealous, and prone to fits of rage. Although Matthew had occasionally sought help for his addiction, he rarely stuck with treatment, believing that his issues could be handled on his own. He was convinced that his problems were everyone else's fault, especially Sarah's. Over time, his accusations grew more frequent, and Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, afraid of setting him off. Despite this, Sarah didn't immediately end the relationship. She believed that she could help him, that love and patience could heal him. But as the months went on, Matthew's behavior became increasingly toxic, and the emotional and physical abuse grew harder to ignore. He began showing up uninvited to Sarah's apartment, insisting on knowing where she was at all times. He would argue with her over trivial things, and sometimes the arguments would escalate into shouting matches, with Matthew lashing out physically. It was clear to Sarah that Matthew's volatile emotions were spiraling, but she remained hopeful that he would eventually get better. On the night of April 12, 2014, their relationship came to a tragic end. Matthew had shown up at Sarah's apartment unannounced, intoxicated and furious over something she had said to one of her friends earlier in the day. He believed that Sarah had been speaking ill of him behind his back, though there was no evidence to support this claim. The argument began with yelling and quickly escalated when Matthew became physically aggressive. Sarah, who had tried to de-escalate the situation, found herself trapped in a violent confrontation. Matthew, in his rage, grabbed a kitchen knife and, in a moment of blind fury, stabbed Sarah multiple times. The attack was brutal and merciless. Sarah had tried to defend herself, but Matthew overpowered her, and within minutes, her life was taken. Neighbors reported hearing the sounds of a violent struggle and Sarah's cries for help, but by the time they reached her apartment, it was too late. Matthew fled the scene shortly after the attack, leaving Sarah to die alone in the apartment. The police arrived soon after receiving a frantic 911 call from a neighbor, but they found only a lifeless Sarah and a trail of blood leading toward the door. The authorities immediately suspected Matthew was involved, as he had been known to have a violent temper, and Sarah had confided in her friends about his increasingly erratic behavior. But when they went to question him, he was nowhere to be found. The manhunt for Matthew Smith began almost immediately. His family, however, was not shocked by his involvement in the murder. They had seen the signs of Matthew's mental and emotional deterioration for years, but despite their best efforts, they had been unable to intervene. They knew that their son's issues with substance abuse, anger, and emotional instability had made him a dangerous person. Matthew had been to rehab multiple times, but he always relapsed, convinced that he didn't need help. His parents had tried to support him, but they too were powerless in the face of his increasing volatility. The police began their search for Matthew, reaching out to his friends, family, and acquaintances to piece together his whereabouts. They soon learned that he had been spotted leaving Melbourne in the hours after the murder, heading north toward New South Wales. Authorities warned local police forces in the surrounding areas, and a nationwide search for Matthew was initiated. Despite his best efforts to evade capture, Matthew's downfall came just 5 days after the murder. A tip from a concerned citizen led the police to a small, remote cabin in the countryside of New South Wales, where Matthew had been hiding out. He was arrested without incident, though he showed no signs of remorse for the crime he had committed. In fact, when questioned by authorities, he seemed detached, as though the brutal murder of Sarah had not fully registered in his mind. The police soon discovered that Matthew had been carrying the knife he used to kill Sarah when they found him. He had wrapped it in a cloth and placed it inside his backpack, a chilling reminder of the violence he had unleashed. It was clear that Matthew had not planned the murder, but his overwhelming emotions had driven him to act impulsively. His past struggles with anger, addiction, and emotional instability had ultimately led him down a path of irreversible destruction. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing Matthew's violent tendencies, his history of abuse, and the tragic events that had unfolded on the night of Sarah's death. They argued that his actions were not the result of a single moment of rage, but rather the culmination of years of unchecked emotional turmoil. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Matthew had not been in control of his actions due to his mental health issues and substance abuse. They pointed to his history of trauma, addiction, and psychological instability, suggesting that these factors had contributed to his violent outburst. But for Sarah's family and friends, there was no justification for what had happened. They had lost someone they loved dearly, someone with so much potential, in a senseless and violent act. They had watched as Sarah tried to make things work with a man who had never truly valued her, and they had witnessed the gradual erosion of her spirit under the weight of Matthew's abusive behavior. They were left with a deep sense of grief, anger, and helplessness. In the end, the jury convicted Matthew Smith of second-degree murder, citing his history of violent behavior and the sheer brutality of the attack. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, though the damage had already been done. No amount of punishment could bring Sarah back, and no sentence could undo the suffering of those who loved her. For Sarah's family, the pain would never truly go away. They were left with the haunting memory of a young woman whose life had been cut short, a tragic victim of a man who had never learned how to manage his emotions, and who had never sought the help he so desperately needed. The trial of Matthew Smith became a national sensation in Australia, as it underscored a much larger issue within society: how addiction, mental health struggles, and domestic violence are often interlinked, and how society tends to overlook the deep-rooted causes until it is too late. Throughout the trial, experts in psychology, mental health, and addiction testified about Matthew's behavior, but nothing could diminish the horror of what had taken place that night. Matthew had been in and out of rehabilitation centers for several years before meeting Sarah. His parents had long worried about their son's ability to control his destructive urges, but they often felt powerless against his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the extent of his problems. While his emotional volatility was well known among his family and friends, no one had ever imagined that it would culminate in murder. But as his behavior worsened, it became clear that Sarah was in danger. She had tried to reach out for help on several occasions, confiding in her closest friends about the constant fear she felt when she was around Matthew. Her friends recalled that she had often said she was worried about the man she loved, but each time she attempted to break things off, Matthew would beg her to stay, promising he would change. She believed that, somehow, love could heal him. However, those close to her knew that Matthew's promises were hollow. They had seen Sarah try, over and over again, to navigate the storm of his emotional and psychological needs, hoping that she could somehow bring stability to his chaotic world. She tried to be patient, understanding, and supportive, but her friends noticed how the bright, independent woman they had known seemed to fade, gradually losing the light in her eyes. She became withdrawn, exhausted, and often anxious, afraid of what would come next. It wasn't just the verbal abuse, but the emotional manipulation that wore her down. In the months before the murder, Sarah had begun to isolate herself from friends and family. She was too ashamed to admit the depth of the problems in her relationship with Matthew. She didn't want to be seen as weak or incapable, so she kept her pain to herself. The night Matthew murdered Sarah was the culmination of months of emotional and psychological abuse. The prosecution was adamant that Matthew's mental state, exacerbated by his addiction, was not an excuse for his actions, but merely a contributing factor. The key issue that they highlighted was that Matthew's violence had been a pattern, one that had escalated over time. Although Sarah had not been the first woman in Matthew's life to experience his temper, she was the one who paid the ultimate price. His ability to switch from charming to enraged in a matter of moments was something that those around him knew all too well. It was this erratic, unpredictable behavior that made him dangerous. On the night of the murder, Matthew had spent the evening drinking heavily, fueling the destructive emotions that already consumed him. When Sarah attempted to assert her independence and have a conversation about their relationship, Matthew's paranoia and jealousy flared up. He accused her of being unfaithful, even though she had never given him any reason to believe this. In his mind, Sarah was always on the verge of betraying him, and no amount of reassurance could calm his fears. The conversation, which had started as a plea for calm, quickly descended into an all-out argument. It was in this heightened state of emotion that Matthew reached for the kitchen knife. Sarah, in a desperate attempt to protect herself, had tried to shield her body, but Matthew overpowered her, stabbing her multiple times. His rage clouded his judgment, and the physical violence took on a life of its own. He had crossed a line that would be impossible to come back from. And when it was over, he stood over Sarah's lifeless body, his mind seemingly devoid of any sense of what he had just done. Matthew's flight after the murder was not one of guilt, but of fear. He was terrified of facing the consequences of his actions, but even more so, he was consumed by the idea that he had finally lost control in the most devastating way. For several days, he wandered the countryside, moving from town to town, trying to outrun the reality of what he had done. But as the investigation moved forward, Matthew could not hide for long. His family, too, was complicit in his escape for a short time, as they had failed to inform the authorities of his whereabouts. His mother, who had long been in denial about his dangerous tendencies, had begged him to turn himself in. But her pleas fell on deaf ears, as Matthew continued to believe that he could somehow evade capture. The police tracked him down after an anonymous tip led them to a small town just outside of New South Wales. Matthew had been hiding out in a cabin, living in a state of emotional disarray. When the officers arrived, they found him in a state of confusion, his disheveled appearance reflecting the turmoil he was experiencing inside. The arrest was made with minimal resistance, but Matthew's silence during his questioning was unnerving. He seemed detached, almost as if he had resigned himself to his fate. His lack of remorse was apparent in his initial statements to police. He denied any premeditation, claiming that the attack had been an accident, a result of his emotional instability and alcohol consumption. He seemed to downplay the severity of the situation, calling it a moment of rage, rather than a conscious act of murder. However, as the investigation continued, more of Matthew's dark past came to light. He had a history of domestic violence, having been involved in at least 2 previous violent relationships. In both cases, his partners had suffered at his hands, but they had either remained silent or had been too afraid to speak out. It became increasingly clear that Matthew's mental state and substance abuse had contributed to his violent behavior, but it was not an excuse. His history of abuse and untreated psychological issues had been a ticking time bomb, and Sarah had unfortunately been the one to set it off. The court would soon be faced with a difficult decision: how to punish a man who was clearly struggling with his inner demons, but had also committed an unforgivable crime. For Sarah's family, the pain of losing their daughter was insurmountable. Her parents spoke to the press, urging others to recognize the signs of abuse and to take action before it's too late. They hoped that Sarah's tragic death would raise awareness about domestic violence and mental health, and that it would serve as a catalyst for change. But no matter how much attention her case brought to these issues, it could never bring Sarah back. Her life had been cut short, and her family's world was shattered by the violent actions of a man who, despite all the help he had been offered, had never been able to control his anger. As the months passed, the fallout from Sarah Collins' tragic death continued to reverberate through the community. Her family, while struggling to cope with the overwhelming grief of losing their beloved daughter, became vocal advocates for raising awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of addressing mental health issues. They were determined that Sarah's death would not be in vain, that the story of her life and the violent end she had suffered could ignite change. Sarah's mother, who had never imagined that her daughter would be in such a situation, became a tireless campaigner for domestic violence survivors. She spoke out about the manipulation and coercion that often accompanies emotionally abusive relationships, encouraging other victims to seek help before it was too late. She recounted the difficult conversations Sarah had had with her about Matthew's controlling behavior, her fear of him, and her attempts to hide the bruises that were becoming more frequent as the months went by. Her mother's heartache was palpable as she spoke to the media, and through her voice, the public began to understand how Sarah's story was not an isolated incident, but a part of a much larger, often hidden epidemic of domestic abuse. Her father, too, joined the effort, calling for more resources to be made available for both victims and perpetrators of abuse. He had watched, helplessly, as his daughter had tried to balance love for someone she believed could change with the reality of the violence that had been building over time. He admitted in interviews that, like many fathers, he had always believed he could protect his children from harm, but in this case, he was unable to protect Sarah from the very person she had loved. He spoke of the pain that came with knowing that his daughter had feared for her safety in her final days, that she had been trapped in a relationship that had slowly consumed her. While the family's advocacy work continued to bring attention to the issues of abuse and mental health, Matthew Smith's trial unfolded in the courtroom. The prosecution painted a grim picture of a man who had not just killed out of a momentary rage, but whose actions had been the result of long-standing issues. His history of violence, combined with his inability to control his impulses, had made him a ticking time bomb. The prosecutor argued that Matthew's mental health struggles, while real, did not absolve him of responsibility for taking another human life. They emphasized the brutal nature of the crime. Sarah had been stabbed repeatedly, with no chance to escape her attacker. They argued that Matthew had been in full control of his actions when he murdered Sarah, even if his judgment had been clouded by his addiction and anger. The defense, however, presented a different narrative. They painted Matthew as a man who had struggled for years with his inner demons, a victim of his own circumstances. They claimed that his mental health issues and addiction were a significant factor in the murder, and that he was not entirely responsible for his actions. The defense team called for leniency, suggesting that Matthew's troubled past and history of trauma should be considered when determining his sentence. They described his life as a constant battle, one that had taken a toll on his mental well-being, making it difficult for him to make rational decisions during the moments leading up to Sarah's death. As the defense rested, the jury was left with the difficult task of determining Matthew Smith's fate. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the nature of the crime itself left little room for doubt. However, the defense's arguments about Matthew's mental state and his struggles with addiction could not be ignored. The question that lingered in the minds of the jurors was whether he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions, or whether his violent outburst was the result of a lifetime of unchecked emotional trauma and substance abuse. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Matthew Smith was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury had concluded that, while his mental health issues and addiction played a significant role in his actions, they did not excuse the brutal way in which he had taken Sarah's life. They found that, in that moment, Matthew had been fully aware of the harm he was causing, and therefore he was responsible for her death. When the judge sentenced Matthew, there was a heavy silence in the courtroom. The Collins family sat in the front row, their faces a mix of exhaustion and sorrow. The sentence was 22 years in prison, a reflection of the severity of the crime, but also taking into account the mitigating circumstances surrounding Matthew's mental health. As the gavel came down, Sarah's family quietly filed out of the courtroom, their grief still fresh, their pain still raw. While they knew that justice had been served in some form, it did little to ease the emptiness they felt knowing that Sarah would never walk through their door again. Matthew's sentence was just one part of the story, but for Sarah's family, it was only a small step toward healing. There was no true closure in the sense that would restore their family, but through their advocacy work and their willingness to speak out about Sarah's life, they began to feel that her death could serve as a catalyst for change. They joined forces with several domestic violence organizations, lobbying for more support for victims of abuse and for stronger laws to protect those who were most vulnerable. The death of Sarah Collins had sparked a movement, one that was rooted in her memory, but was also dedicated to saving lives. Though Sarah was gone, her legacy lived on in the work her family and friends carried forward. Her death was not just a tragic loss of life. It was a stark reminder of the silent suffering that many people endure in abusive relationships. For those who were still trapped in similar situations, Sarah's story would become a symbol of hope, a call to seek help before it was too late. Sarah's voice, though silent, continued to echo, urging others to break free from the chains of abuse and to find a way to live without fear. The road to healing for Sarah's family was long and painful, but through their tireless work, they began to find meaning in their loss. They knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with difficulty, but they were determined to ensure that Sarah's memory lived on in a way that honored her life and her fight for peace. And in that way, perhaps Sarah's death could be the catalyst for the kind of change that might prevent another family from experiencing the same pain they had endured. Story 8. In 2014, Australia witnessed a horrifying case that shocked the nation, one that would go down in criminal history for its chilling brutality and the tragic loss of life. The case revolved around a man named Jack Miller, a 29-year-old former boxer who had been struggling with depression, substance abuse, and a violent past. His history of abuse and rage had been known to those closest to him, but no one ever thought it would escalate to the unthinkable. Jack grew up in a rough neighborhood in Melbourne, where violence was often the answer to every problem. Raised in a broken home with an absentee father and a mother who battled her own demons, Jack learned from a young age to fend for himself. His anger issues began early, often manifested through fights with classmates, and as he grew older, they turned into a destructive force that shaped his adult life. Jack's violent tendencies were well known in the boxing gym, where he quickly gained a reputation for being ruthless and unpredictable. His raw talent made him a feared competitor in the ring, but outside of it, his temper was just as volatile. His downfall came not in the boxing ring, but in the streets of Melbourne. At 29, Jack was battling depression and had become heavily addicted to drugs and alcohol. These addictions, combined with his unresolved emotional trauma, created a volatile mix that was impossible for those around him to manage. Despite his promising boxing career, he had failed to find stability, losing sponsorship deals and falling deeper into his destructive lifestyle. His relationships had all but crumbled, and his friends and family had long been concerned for his well-being. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Jack had been in and out of rehab multiple times, but each stint was short-lived, and his addiction always pulled him back into the depths of despair. He had a volatile relationship with his girlfriend, Claire Johnson, a 26-year-old nurse who had been trying to help him for months. Claire had fallen in love with Jack, believing that he could turn his life around. She saw the potential in him, even when others had written him off. However, Jack's instability and bouts of rage were becoming harder for Claire to ignore. Jack's violent outbursts were no longer isolated incidents, but a regular pattern that was escalating. He would often lash out at Claire in moments of jealousy, rage, or insecurity. He accused her of cheating on him, even though she had never given him any reason to doubt her. The constant turmoil in their relationship had taken a toll on Claire, who was starting to realize that she might never be able to save Jack from himself. Friends of Claire, who had witnessed the deterioration of her once bright personality into one of exhaustion and fear, pleaded with her to leave him. But Claire remained hopeful, still holding on to the belief that Jack could change, that love could be the catalyst for his recovery. That belief would be tested in the worst possible way on one fateful evening in late 2014. Jack had been drinking heavily and using methamphetamine when he returned to their apartment after a heated argument earlier that day. Claire, tired of the constant emotional roller coaster, had been thinking about ending their relationship for good. She had spent the evening at a friend's house, attempting to clear her mind. When she returned home later that night, she found Jack in a manic state, raving about perceived betrayals and his feeling of being trapped in his own skin. As the night wore on, Jack's paranoia and aggression grew more intense. Claire tried to calm him down, but her efforts only seemed to enrage him further. The argument quickly spiraled out of control, and in a blind fit of rage, Jack grabbed a nearby kitchen knife. The weapon, so simple and innocuous in nature, became the instrument of Claire's tragic death. He stabbed her repeatedly, with the violence of the attack reflecting the deep-seated anger and hurt that Jack had been carrying for years. In the aftermath, Jack's reaction was chillingly detached. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Jack standing over Claire's lifeless body, covered in blood. His demeanor was eerily calm, almost as if he had been in a trance. He showed no remorse for what he had done, his mind clouded by drugs and his own mental state, but it was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. As the officers took him into custody, Jack was silent, offering no resistance. The investigation revealed a tragic portrait of a man whose life had spiraled out of control. Jack had been a ticking time bomb, and the violence he unleashed that night was the inevitable outcome of his untreated mental health issues, addiction, and history of abusive behavior. The police learned that Claire had attempted to end their relationship several times, but Jack had convinced her to stay, promising that he would get help. She had made it clear to her friends and family that she feared Jack's instability, but she had continued to hold on to the hope that one day he would change. As the details of the crime came to light, the community was left reeling from the brutality of the act. Jack Miller's story was not one of a man driven by a single moment of rage, but a story of years of unresolved issues and escalating violence that had finally culminated in the most horrific of outcomes. Claire Johnson's death was a stark reminder of how untreated mental health issues and addiction could destroy not just the person suffering, but everyone around them. The trial of Jack Miller in early 2015 was a media sensation. The defense team argued that Jack's mental state, compounded by his substance abuse, meant that he was not fully aware of the consequences of his actions. They portrayed him as a man who had never been given the proper tools to deal with his anger and depression. They painted a picture of a man who had been failed by society, a victim of his own demons. The prosecution, however, argued that Jack's past behavior, including numerous instances of violence and threats, showed a clear pattern of escalating aggression that could not be attributed solely to his addiction. They emphasized that the brutal nature of the attack on Claire, as well as his complete lack of remorse afterward, indicated that this was not an impulsive crime, but one that had been building for some time. The jury deliberated for days, weighing the factors of Jack's mental health and addiction against the severity of the crime. They ultimately found Jack Miller guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a decision that left Claire's family devastated. They struggled to understand how someone could take the life of a kind, loving person like Claire and be given such a relatively light sentence. For them, the punishment seemed insufficient compared to the loss they had endured. Jack Miller's conviction and sentence sparked debates across Australia about the intersection of mental health, addiction, and violent crime. Many felt that the justice system had failed to hold Jack fully accountable for his actions, while others argued that his history of trauma and addiction should have been considered more heavily. Nonetheless, the case highlighted the importance of early intervention for those struggling with mental health issues and addiction, and how failure to address these problems can have devastating consequences. For Claire's family, there was no closure, only the long, painful journey of trying to pick up the pieces of their lives. They would never get to see Claire marry, have children, or live the full life she had dreamed of. Instead, they were left with the haunting memory of a vibrant young woman taken too soon by the violence of a man who had never learned to control his anger. As Jack Miller's trial progressed, more details about his past came to light, shedding light on the troubled history that had ultimately led to Claire's tragic death. The courtroom was filled with tense moments, as Claire's family and friends sat in the front row, their faces marked with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. For them, each piece of evidence painted a grim picture of a relationship that had been plagued by abuse and deceit. The prosecution began by presenting a series of testimonies from friends and family members who had witnessed the deterioration of Claire's relationship with Jack. One close friend, Sarah Evans, described how she had watched Claire slowly withdraw from her social circle as she became more and more isolated. Claire had always been a kind and vibrant person, but over the past year, Sarah noticed a significant change. She described Claire as often tired and anxious, with bruises on her arms that Claire tried to hide. Sarah recalled one conversation in which Claire had confided in her about Jack's increasingly erratic behavior, but Claire had been reluctant to call the relationship off. "I don't think he can help it," Sarah remembered Claire saying, her voice heavy with sadness. "He's just really lost. He's not a bad person, he just doesn't know how to deal with his anger." Sarah had pleaded with Claire to seek help, to talk to someone about what she was going through, but Claire always seemed to make excuses for Jack's behavior. "He's better when he's sober," Claire would say, or "he's just had a rough time lately. He loves me, I know he does." But as the months went by, Jack's outbursts became more frequent and more violent. Friends and family tried to reach out, but they were too late. The web of manipulation that Jack had created around Claire had made it nearly impossible for her to see that she was in a dangerous situation. The defense team, however, tried to argue that Jack's violent behavior was a result of his mental health struggles and addiction. They presented expert witnesses who testified that Jack's childhood, marked by neglect and abuse, had left deep scars on his psyche. His addiction to methamphetamine had exacerbated these issues, making it nearly impossible for him to control his emotions when under the influence. The defense painted Jack as a broken man, a victim of his past, whose uncontrollable rage had led him down a dark path. One psychiatrist who had been consulted by the defense argued that Jack's actions on the night of Claire's death were the result of a dissociative episode caused by his severe addiction. He claimed that Jack had been trapped in a mental state that left him unable to make rational decisions. The psychiatrist emphasized that Jack had been struggling with intense feelings of abandonment and shame, which had built up over years of unresolved trauma. They suggested that the methamphetamine had clouded his judgment, making it nearly impossible for him to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. They recommended that Jack receive treatment for his mental health issues and addiction, and that he should be given a chance to rehabilitate himself. In contrast, the prosecution argued that while Jack's mental health issues and addiction were real, they did not excuse the brutal murder of Claire. They painted a different picture of Jack, a man who had used his past as an excuse for his violent tendencies, a man who had allowed his addiction to rule his life. They pointed to the severity of the attack, emphasizing that Jack's multiple stabs to Claire's chest and abdomen were not the actions of a man who had lost control, in a fleeting moment of anger. They argued that Jack had been fully aware of the consequences of his actions, and that he had consciously made the decision to kill. The prosecutor's final argument was a plea for justice for Claire, whose life had been stolen by someone who had shown no remorse for what he had done. They reminded the jury that, despite Jack's troubled past, Claire had never deserved to die in such a brutal and senseless way. She was a kind, loving woman who believed in the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it, the prosecutor said, and she didn't deserve to die at the hands of the man she loved. Jack Miller's actions cannot be justified by his mental health struggles or his addiction. He made a choice that night, and he must be held accountable for that choice. Meanwhile, the defense held firm in their belief that Jack was a product of his environment, and that his violent tendencies were a result of years of abuse and neglect. They argued that Jack had not acted out of malice or premeditation, but rather out of an overwhelming sense of emotional turmoil and confusion. They highlighted the fact that Jack had been trying, in his own way, to overcome his issues. He had sought treatment for his addiction and had been attending therapy before the tragic incident. The defense suggested that, had Jack been given more support and a better chance to heal, the violence may have never occurred. Throughout the trial, Jack sat silently in the defendant's chair, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. At times, he appeared lost in thought, as though he were disconnected from the reality of the courtroom. But at other moments, the anger inside him seemed to resurface, his jaw tightening as the prosecution described the pain and suffering he had caused. There was no outburst, no emotional breakdown, only the eerie silence of a man who had committed an unforgivable act. As the trial entered its final stages, the jury was left with the daunting task of determining Jack Miller's fate. The evidence of his violent tendencies was overwhelming, but the arguments of the defense regarding his mental state and addiction left the jury with difficult questions to answer. Could Jack be held fully accountable for his actions, given his mental health struggles? Or was he truly a victim of his past, someone who had been driven to violence by forces beyond his control? The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the evidence, considering the testimonies, and discussing the complex nature of Jack's character. They knew that their decision would have far-reaching implications, not only for Jack, but also for the family and friends of Claire, who had suffered unimaginable loss. Finally, after much discussion, they reached a verdict. Jack Miller was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury believed that while Jack's mental health issues and addiction played a significant role in the crime, they did not absolve him of responsibility for Claire's death. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair. Claire's family had hoped for a harsher sentence, one that would reflect the brutality of the crime and the pain they had suffered. But the judge, taking into account Jack's mental health history and the mitigating circumstances, handed down a sentence of 15 years in prison. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Claire's family was devastated, feeling that Jack's punishment did not match the severity of his actions. But they were determined to honor Claire's memory, and in the face of this injustice, they vowed to continue speaking out against domestic violence and addiction, hoping to prevent another family from experiencing the same heartbreak they had endured. For Jack, the long road ahead in prison would not be one of redemption. His time behind bars would be a chance for him to reflect on the choices he had made. But for Claire's family, it would never bring their daughter, sister, and friend back. Claire Johnson's life had been tragically cut short by a man who had been given every chance to change, but ultimately chose to destroy the person who loved him most. Her story would remain a warning to others about the destructive power of addiction, anger, and unresolved trauma, and a testament to the importance of recognizing the signs of abuse before it was too late. In the years that followed Jack Miller's conviction, the tragic murder of Claire Johnson remained a topic of discussion throughout the local community. Claire's death was more than just a headline or a case file. It became a symbol of the dangers of untreated mental health issues, addiction, and the often hidden violence that can erupt in relationships. Despite Jack Miller's relatively light sentence, the case sparked widespread debates about how the justice system handled such crimes, and whether mental health considerations were being used too liberally to excuse violent acts. Claire's family, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive. They began speaking out publicly about domestic violence, addiction, and the importance of seeking help for mental health issues. They became active advocates for both victims of domestic abuse and those struggling with addiction, using Claire's story as a cautionary tale. They spoke at schools, community centers, and even on national platforms, hoping to raise awareness about the cycle of violence that had ultimately led to Claire's tragic death. Her mother, Karen Johnson, was particularly vocal about the warning signs that had been present in Jack Miller's behavior long before the night of the murder. Karen would often speak about Claire's increasing isolation, the bruises she had tried to hide, and the many times Claire had confided in her about her fears of Jack's anger. Karen expressed her anger at the system that allowed a man with such a history of violence and untreated mental illness to go unchecked for so long, and she called for better resources for those who needed help before they became a threat to others. However, the journey for Claire's family was anything but easy. Even as they fought for justice and awareness, they were also left grappling with their grief. They had loved Claire deeply, and her sudden and violent loss was something they would never truly recover from. There were days when it felt as though the pain would never end, as though the hole Claire had left in their hearts would never heal. But with each passing year, the family took solace in knowing that Claire's legacy had inspired a movement toward understanding the hidden horrors of domestic abuse and mental health struggles. As for Jack Miller, the years spent in prison did little to change the man he had become. His time behind bars was marked by fits of rage and further displays of violence. He attempted to enroll in rehabilitation programs, but his progress was slow, hindered by his deeply ingrained anger and bitterness. Jack's mental health issues, which had been exacerbated by years of substance abuse, remained a constant challenge. He participated in therapy sessions, but he still showed little remorse for his actions. His remorse seemed more rooted in regret for getting caught than for the life he had taken. In a rare interview with the media years after his conviction, Jack was asked if he felt any guilt for what he had done. His response was telling, "I wasn't myself that night. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't the man I used to be. I was just lost. I can't change what happened. I'll live with that for the rest of my life." There was no acknowledgement of Claire's humanity, no recognition of the pain he had caused her family. It was a response that left many frustrated, especially Claire's family, who had hoped that with time, Jack would come to terms with the devastation he had caused. But the reality was that Jack had never truly taken responsibility for his actions. His mental health issues had been used as an excuse, and while they may have contributed to his violent outburst, they did not absolve him of the choice he made that night. As the years passed, Jack's sentence was reduced due to good behavior, and he became eligible for parole. His supporters, including his defense team, argued that he had made significant strides in dealing with his mental health issues, and they urged the parole board to consider his rehabilitation. However, Claire's family was steadfast in their opposition to Jack's release. They argued that Jack had shown no genuine remorse, and they feared that he would only continue to hurt others once he was free. For them, the idea of Jack walking out of prison after what he had done was unthinkable. When the parole hearing finally arrived, it was another painful chapter in the ongoing trauma that Claire's family had endured. Karen Johnson, now an advocate for domestic violence survivors, addressed the board with unwavering conviction. She spoke of Claire's vibrant spirit, her kindness, and her passion for life, qualities that had been stolen from her by Jack's violence. She reminded the board that Claire had trusted Jack, loved him despite his faults, and had tried so desperately to save him. But in the end, it was Claire who had paid the ultimate price for Jack's failures. "We are here today, still fighting for Claire, because she never had the chance to fight for herself," Karen told the board. "She was taken from us in a way that no one should ever experience. Jack Miller took her future, and now we are left with the pain of knowing we will never see her again." In the end, the parole board decided to deny Jack Miller's request for release. They cited his lack of genuine remorse and the ongoing risk he posed to others as reasons for their decision. For Claire's family, this was a small victory, but it did little to ease the pain of losing her. Jack would remain behind bars, but the wounds Claire's family carried would never fully heal. Claire's story, however, was far from over. Her family's advocacy work grew over the years, and they helped pass several pieces of legislation aimed at improving domestic violence prevention and mental health treatment. They also started a foundation in Claire's name to provide support to victims of domestic abuse and to raise awareness about the connection between addiction and violence. The foundation became a beacon of hope for many, offering resources and support to those who had been through similar experiences. Claire's family found a sense of purpose in their grief, channeling their pain into making a difference in the lives of others. And though they would never see Claire again, they knew that her legacy lived on in the work they were doing. Through their tireless efforts, they honored Claire's memory and ensured that her tragic death would not be in vain. For Jack Miller, the years spent behind bars would serve as a reminder of the life he had destroyed. Whether or not he ever truly understood the magnitude of his actions, his crime would never be forgotten. And as the years continued to pass, the case of Jack Miller and Claire Johnson served as a somber reminder of the dangers of untreated mental illness, addiction, and the dark reality of domestic violence. The cycle of abuse may have been broken for some, but for others, the scars left behind would never fade. Story 9. In 2014, the city of San Diego was rocked by a chilling and violent crime that would leave the community reeling for years. The perpetrator was a 26-year-old man named Travis Cooper, a quiet, seemingly unremarkable individual who had recently been discharged from the military after serving overseas. Friends and family described Travis as a person who had always kept to himself, never quite fitting in, but generally well-mannered. He had no known history of violence, and he had no criminal record prior to the events that would forever change his life and the lives of those around him. Travis had returned from his deployment in the Middle East a few months prior, visibly changed. While his military service had been a source of pride for his family, it seemed that the war had left deep scars on his psyche. He had difficulty adjusting to civilian life, and his relationships, both with his family and his few friends, began to deteriorate. Travis struggled with intense feelings of anger, disconnection, and anxiety, which often led to outbursts of frustration. The once calm and reserved man had turned unpredictable and volatile, especially when faced with stress or triggers from his time in combat. Despite his internal struggles, Travis continued to live in the same apartment complex in the heart of San Diego. His neighbors often described him as quiet, rarely interacting with others. But those who had been close to him before his deployment started noticing a disturbing change in his behavior. He withdrew even more, spending most of his time alone in his apartment. He would drink heavily on weekends, and his temper would flare at the smallest provocation. It wasn't long before his mental health deteriorated further, with Travis becoming increasingly paranoid and distant. On the evening of July 15, 2014, the quiet suburban neighborhood where Travis lived was shattered by a brutal and senseless murder. The victim was a 24-year-old woman named Emily Parker, a kind and outgoing individual who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Emily was known for her compassion and selflessness, always putting others before herself. She had grown up in San Diego and was beloved by everyone who knew her. Emily had recently started dating Travis, a relationship that had been growing over the last few months. At first, her friends were hesitant about the pairing, given Travis's increasingly erratic behavior, but Emily was determined to help him, convinced that his struggles were a result of his time in the military. It was on that fateful evening that Emily's efforts to reach out to Travis would ultimately cost her life. Around 9:30 p.m., a loud commotion was heard coming from Travis's apartment. Neighbors who were in close proximity to his unit reported hearing shouting, followed by the unmistakable sound of furniture being overturned. Then, complete silence. Some neighbors went to investigate, but Travis's door remained shut. A few hours later, when the police arrived at the apartment complex in response to a 911 call made by a concerned neighbor, they found Emily's body inside Travis's apartment, lying in a pool of blood. Emily had been brutally murdered. Her throat had been slashed, and multiple stab wounds covered her torso. The sheer brutality of the attack left investigators stunned. The scene suggested a crime of intense emotion, rage, hate, or deep personal conflict. As officers began their investigation, one of the first leads they pursued was Travis Cooper. It wasn't long before they found that Travis had been the last person to see Emily alive. When the police arrived at Travis's apartment, they found him sitting motionless in his living room. His clothes were stained with blood, and he appeared disoriented and dazed. At first, Travis didn't respond to questions from officers. His eyes glazed over as if he were in a trance. When the police asked him about Emily, Travis simply said, "She's gone. I didn't want it to happen. I didn't mean to do it." A search of Travis's apartment revealed a grim scene. In addition to Emily's body, the apartment was filled with military memorabilia, weapons, and bottles of alcohol. It became clear that Travis had not been in a stable state of mind, and the investigation quickly pointed to the possibility of a crime influenced by his mental health struggles. As the investigation into the murder of Emily Parker continued, detectives uncovered a series of unsettling details about Travis Cooper's recent life. His military records showed a history of untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and a series of unresolved mental health issues stemming from his deployment. Travis had sought therapy briefly while in the service, but he had not followed through with treatment after his return to civilian life. It seemed that the pressure of adjusting to life outside the military, combined with his worsening mental health, had pushed Travis into a violent spiral. Friends of Emily and Travis reported that the two had argued intensely earlier that evening, with Emily expressing concern over Travis's growing instability and his refusal to seek help. It was during this argument that things escalated, leading to the tragic events that would unfold within the confines of that apartment. The police learned that Travis had been spiraling for weeks before the murder. Emily had become increasingly worried about his behavior, especially his violent outbursts and erratic mood swings. She had even suggested that he return to counseling, but Travis rejected the idea, convinced that he could handle everything on his own. According to Emily's friends, she had tried to comfort him, to help him work through his issues, but she was afraid that his mental state had deteriorated beyond repair. Emily's last words, as reported by a neighbor who overheard part of the argument through the thin walls of their apartment, were filled with fear and desperation. She begged Travis to stop drinking and to talk to her, but Travis was beyond reasoning. In his mind, Emily was a reminder of the life he could never have, a life free from the horrors of war. He blamed her for pushing him to confront his demons, believing that her attempts to help him were futile and that she could never truly understand what he had been through. It was in this irrational state of mind that he turned violent, driven by the pain of his past and the overwhelming weight of his mental illness. The police were quick to arrest Travis Cooper, charging him with first-degree murder. In the following weeks, the case would draw national attention, not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the deeper issue it highlighted: the struggles of veterans returning home from war and the mental health crises they often face. In the months leading up to his trial, there was a growing outcry from both the public and mental health advocates, who called for better support systems for veterans suffering from PTSD and other mental health disorders. Many argued that while Travis's actions were inexcusable, they were also a tragic result of a system that had failed him. As the legal process unfolded, Travis Cooper's defense attorneys painted a picture of a man deeply broken by his experiences in the military. They argued that his actions, though horrifying, were a direct result of untreated PTSD, a mental health condition that had been ignored for far too long. His attorneys presented expert testimony from psychiatrists who spoke about the severe impact that combat had on Travis's mental health. They emphasized his struggles with hypervigilance, nightmares, and the overwhelming sense of guilt that came from his time serving overseas. His legal team claimed that these factors, combined with his alcohol abuse, had driven him to a state of temporary insanity during the murder. Despite the defense's argument, the prosecution remained firm in their stance that the murder was a result of Travis's inability to control his violent impulses, not just his mental health issues. They pointed to the brutal nature of the crime, how Travis had not only killed Emily, but had also mutilated her body with a series of stabs after slashing her throat. The sheer rage displayed during the murder indicated a level of premeditation and personal animosity that went beyond any mental health diagnosis, the prosecution argued. Emily's family, who had been at the center of the case since the moment they received the call about her death, had a very different perspective on Travis's mental health. For them, Emily's life had been violently taken, and there was no way to bring her back. In the months leading up to the trial, the case garnered significant media attention. Local news outlets regularly covered the progress of the investigation, offering updates on Travis's psychological evaluation and the ongoing debates about how PTSD should be factored into criminal trials. Emily's family, while devastated by the loss of their daughter, was determined to see justice served. They hired a high-profile attorney to represent them in the case, and made sure to speak out about their feelings on the defense's attempts to shift the blame onto mental illness. The family also expressed frustration with the system that had failed Travis. "I understand that PTSD is a serious issue," Emily's father, Robert Parker, said in an interview, "but it doesn't give anyone the right to take another person's life. It's no excuse. My daughter is gone, and we'll never get her back." He had opportunities to seek help. He had people who cared for him, including Emily. But instead, he chose to hurt her. Robert's words were echoed by Emily's mother, who spoke of the warmth and light that Emily had brought into the world, and how the tragedy of her loss had shattered their family. The Parkers expressed their heartbreak, not only for their daughter, but also for the fact that Travis had been allowed to spiral so far without intervention. Emily's mother, Christine, made it clear that, while they had compassion for the struggles that Travis had endured, it did not erase the fact that Emily was the one who had paid the ultimate price. For Travis, the trial was an emotionally tumultuous experience. While he was not entirely incapable of understanding the magnitude of his actions, his defense attorneys argued that his state of mind at the time of the murder made it impossible for him to form the intent required for a first-degree murder conviction. The trial became a tug-of-war between his mental health struggles and the horrific nature of his crime. As the prosecution painted Travis as a man who had carefully planned and executed the murder in a fit of jealousy and rage, the defense focused on his broken mind, torn apart by the horrors of war and exacerbated by his alcohol addiction. Despite the defense's best efforts, the jury found Travis Cooper guilty of second-degree murder. It was a conviction that the Parkers felt was a bittersweet victory. They were relieved that Travis would spend time in prison for his actions, but no amount of justice could bring Emily back. The verdict, however, was a clear message to the public. Mental illness could not be used as a free pass for violence. Travis was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crime, even as it acknowledged the deep issues that had contributed to his actions. During the sentencing, Travis spoke briefly to the court. His words were filled with remorse, though they lacked the emotional depth that many had hoped to hear. "I can never take back what I did," he said, his voice shaky. "I never wanted to hurt her. I loved her, and I'm so sorry for what I did. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wish I could undo it. I couldn't control it. I'm sorry." His words were met with a mix of reactions. Emily's family, still reeling from their loss, struggled to find peace in his apology. For them, no words could change the fact that Emily was gone, nor could they heal the scars that Travis had left behind. In the years that followed, the case remained a powerful example of the deep connection between mental health, trauma, and violence. It sparked debates not only about PTSD and its effects on veterans, but also about the broader issue of how mental illness intersects with criminal behavior. While many veterans like Travis struggled in silence, their battles were often invisible to the public, and the long-lasting effects of war went unaddressed. Travis's time in prison was marked by continued struggles with his mental health. He was placed in a psychiatric unit within the correctional facility, where he received ongoing therapy and treatment for his PTSD. But even in the controlled environment of the prison, Travis continued to battle with the demons that had driven him to commit the unspeakable act. While some believed that he showed genuine remorse, others questioned whether he would ever truly understand the consequences of his actions. For the Parker family, their healing process was slow and painful. Emily's death left a hole in their hearts that could never be filled, but they remained determined to honor her memory by speaking out about domestic violence, mental health, and the importance of support systems for individuals struggling with trauma. Through their advocacy work, they helped raise awareness about the challenges faced by veterans returning home from war, and they pushed for better mental health resources for those in need. Their grief, while immeasurable, became a driving force in their mission to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. Travis Cooper's story, like so many others, was a reminder of the complexities that surround mental illness, violence, and the consequences of untreated trauma. In the end, it was a tragedy that no one could truly explain, but one that left an indelible mark on the lives of those involved, both the victim and the perpetrator. The years following the trial of Travis Cooper saw continued discussions around the complicated intersection of military service, mental health, and criminal justice. While Travis served his prison sentence, efforts were ramping up across the United States to address the alarming rates of PTSD and suicide among veterans, particularly those returning from combat zones. There was a growing recognition that the military often failed to properly care for those who served, leaving many veterans to fend for themselves in a civilian world that did not understand their struggles. Travis became one of many faces of this problem. His case highlighted how untreated PTSD could manifest in violent ways, but it also served as a reminder of the trauma that so many veterans carried with them long after they left the battlefield. His case was brought up time and time again in debates about how society, and specifically the government, handled the mental health of military personnel. Some advocates believed that Travis's crime was a direct result of a systemic failure, one that failed to provide adequate support to men and women who had risked their lives abroad, only to return home to face an entirely different battle, one within their own minds. These voices, along with the Parker family's ongoing advocacy, pushed for the expansion of programs designed to help soldiers transition back into civilian life. However, for the Parker family, their pain remained fresh. Emily's absence left a hollow space in their lives, a constant reminder of what had been taken from them. The healing process was long and painful, and no amount of media attention or advocacy could bring Emily back. They continued to remember their daughter not as a victim, but as a vibrant, caring person who had always tried to help others, even when she could not help herself. Emily's parents, Robert and Christine, attended support groups for families who had lost loved ones to violence, where they spoke openly about their daughter's murder. They became advocates for victim rights, pushing for justice and greater awareness about the psychological toll that trauma could take on individuals. The idea of forgiveness had been a contentious one for the Parkers throughout the trial and its aftermath. While they felt a sense of justice with Travis's conviction, they could not deny the humanity of the man who had taken their daughter's life. Christine Parker, in particular, struggled with the concept of forgiveness, feeling as though it would somehow diminish the significance of Emily's life and the brutality of her death. Yet, over time, she found herself drawn into a larger conversation about the cycle of violence and healing, and the realization that forgiveness could also be part of the healing process for them. Robert Parker, in a public interview some years after the trial, expressed a sentiment that resonated with many who had followed the case. "Forgiving him doesn't mean we forget what happened," Robert explained. "It doesn't bring Emily back. It doesn't change the reality that she's gone. But I think it's something we have to do for ourselves in order to find some peace. We've already been through hell, and the bitterness of hatred won't help anyone. It's a way for us to move forward, even when the pain never really goes away." In prison, Travis was not without his own struggles. The psychological toll of his crime weighed heavily on him, and his mental state did not improve in the years following his conviction. He spent much of his time in the psychiatric ward, receiving therapy, medications, and counseling. There were reports that Travis had shown remorse for his actions, and at times, he expressed a desire to reach out to Emily's family. However, his letters were never sent, as he feared they would be seen as an attempt to manipulate or ease his conscience rather than genuine remorse. There was a growing sense among some of his prison counselors that Travis might never be able to fully understand the magnitude of his actions. While he had made strides in his mental health treatment, his ability to accept full responsibility for the murder was hindered by his ongoing battles with guilt, self-hatred, and the heavy burden of his PTSD. Some believed that, in his own way, Travis was trapped in the same cycle of violence that he had inflicted on Emily. The case continued to make ripples in the legal and mental health communities. The more that people learned about Travis's history and his struggles, the more they began to understand the complexities of his crime. Was he just another victim of an under-resourced mental health system that failed him? Or was he a man who had crossed a line, unable to take responsibility for the violence he had committed, regardless of the psychological trauma he had experienced? Both sides presented compelling arguments, and while public opinion varied, it became clear that Travis's story was not an isolated one. It was a reflection of broader issues that needed to be addressed at a societal level. In the years following the trial, the case of Travis Cooper became a landmark example of the complexities of the criminal justice system's handling of mental illness. The debate raged on over the adequacy of military mental health care, how PTSD should be treated in the context of criminal cases, and what responsibility the government had in ensuring that veterans like Travis received the care and attention they needed to reintegrate into civilian life. It was a case that served as both a tragedy and a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Emily's parents dedicated themselves to creating a foundation in her memory. They established the Emily Parker Foundation, which was focused on supporting mental health awareness and providing resources for those affected by PTSD and trauma. Through the foundation, they provided scholarships for veterans seeking mental health treatment and supported programs for families who had lost loved ones to violence. While nothing could erase the pain they felt, the Parkers found solace in knowing that Emily's legacy was helping others heal from the same kinds of pain that had destroyed their family. For Travis, the future remained uncertain. He was serving his sentence, continuing to work through his mental health struggles behind prison walls. Whether he would ever truly understand the depths of his actions, or find a way to atone for them, remained to be seen. For now, the legal system had dealt with the case, but the emotional scars left by the murder of Emily Parker would remain, not only in the hearts of those who loved her, but also in the society that had failed both her and the man who had taken her life. Story 10. In the late afternoon of September 16, 2014, in a small suburban neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, the lives of two families were irrevocably altered. The man at the center of this tragedy was 34-year-old Michael Freeman, a man known by his neighbors as quiet, solitary, and often reclusive. Despite his unassuming presence, Michael harbored deep-seated resentments and a history of mental health struggles, including depression and a tendency towards violent outbursts when he felt slighted or ignored. Michael had grown up in a family plagued by dysfunction and poverty. His father had been an alcoholic, often abusive, while his mother struggled with her own mental health issues, often disappearing for days or weeks at a time. Michael's childhood was marked by instability, leaving him with a profound sense of anger and abandonment that would later manifest in his adulthood. Though he had managed to hold down jobs over the years, he had always been on the fringes, never truly fitting in with those around him. He had few friends and kept to himself, spending much of his time in the small, rundown house that he had inherited from his late parents. It was in this house that Michael's anger began to build over the course of several months in 2014. He had grown increasingly frustrated with his life, the weight of his unresolved trauma from childhood bearing down on him. His neighbors, who had only ever seen him come and go quietly, had begun to notice his erratic behavior, shouting at cars that drove too fast on the street, having loud arguments with himself in his yard, and occasionally making cryptic comments about feeling like the world was against him. Michael's mental health deteriorated further when he lost his job at a local construction company. The job had been one of the few things in his life that provided him with a sense of purpose, and without it, he felt entirely adrift. His social isolation worsened, and his anger began to turn inward, festering and growing until it became a dangerous, explosive force. The tragedy began on a regular evening in mid-September. Michael had been sitting in his living room, staring at the walls of his house, the weight of his life pressing in on him. He had been drinking heavily that day, and his thoughts turned bitter. He blamed the world around him for his failures, for the years of neglect he had endured, and the isolation that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As the evening wore on, he grew more and more agitated. It wasn't the first time he had felt like this, but this time it felt different. Something was pushing him towards the edge, urging him to act on his darkest impulses. At the same time, a few houses down the street, the Parker family was preparing for a peaceful evening at home. Sarah and David Parker were a married couple with two children, 9-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Lucas. They had lived in the neighborhood for years and were well known for being kind-hearted and approachable. Sarah was a local schoolteacher, and David worked as a manager at a nearby retail store. They had lived a comfortable, middle-class life and were well-liked by the community. They had no idea that the man they had often seen walking alone down the street was preparing to turn their quiet neighborhood into the scene of a violent tragedy. It all began when Michael, after yet another argument with himself, stepped out of his house into the cool evening air. The distant sounds of children playing and the laughter of neighbors filled the air as he walked aimlessly down the street. His eyes narrowed as he passed the Parker household. He had been simmering with anger for weeks now, and he was particularly irritated by the sounds of children's laughter. Something about it, to him, felt like a cruel reminder of what he had never had, what he had lost in his own life. The sight of the Parker children playing in the yard, the sound of their carefree laughter, seemed to trigger something deep within him. His rage flared, fueled by years of pent-up resentment. Without any warning, Michael pulled a handgun from the waistband of his pants. The weapon, which he had purchased months earlier from an unlicensed seller, was not legally registered. He had kept it hidden, but his sense of control over his own life was slipping, and he had begun to think about using it. This night, it felt like the only way to assert himself, to make his presence known in a world that had ignored him for so long. As he approached the Parker house, the sounds of the children's laughter intensified in his ears, pushing him further into a state of rage. Michael approached the front yard of the Parker family's home, where Sarah was sitting on the porch, watching her children play. She had no way of knowing that the quiet neighbor she had often waved to was now walking toward her with a deadly intent. Before she could even react, Michael raised the gun and fired several shots at Sarah, striking her in the chest and sending her crashing to the ground. Emma and Lucas screamed in horror. Their joyful play turned to terror in an instant. David Parker, who had been inside the house, rushed out upon hearing the gunfire. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw Sarah lying motionless on the ground and Michael standing over her, the gun still in his hand. The sight of the gun caused David to freeze for a moment, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. But then, driven by the instinct to protect his family, he rushed towards Michael, attempting to tackle him and disarm him. Michael, though startled by David's intervention, was still fueled by his uncontrollable anger. In the chaotic struggle that ensued, another shot rang out, striking David in the leg. He collapsed to the ground, his vision blurred with pain, but he refused to stop. He grabbed Michael's wrist, trying to force the gun from his grip, but Michael was too strong. The two men continued to grapple, rolling on the ground, as Emma and Lucas stood frozen, horrified by the violence unfolding before them. At that moment, a neighbor who had heard the gunfire called 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and the neighbor, frantic, reported the shooting. Officers were dispatched immediately, but by the time they arrived, the damage had already been done. Michael Freeman had shot and killed Sarah Parker in cold blood, leaving David severely wounded and the children traumatized. As the officers stormed into the yard, Michael was still standing over David, the gun now pointed downward in his hand. He seemed almost disconnected from reality, his face blank, his expression cold. Michael didn't resist when the police ordered him to drop the weapon. He complied immediately, allowing them to arrest him without a fight. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and child endangerment. The arrest marked the beginning of a long and painful legal process that would see Michael Freeman face the consequences of his actions. But for the Parker family, there was no trial that could bring Sarah back or undo the trauma that had been inflicted on their children. The ripple effects of that evening's violence would haunt them for years to come, as they tried to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the senseless tragedy. In the months that followed, the community rallied around the Parker family, offering support and condolences. Friends and neighbors organized fundraisers, and local schools held memorials for Sarah, honoring the teacher who had touched so many lives. The Parker children, though young, would carry the memory of that night with them for the rest of their lives, and Sarah's absence left a deep void in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Michael Freeman's trial would take place the following year, and as the case moved forward, the community struggled to come to terms with the violence that had shattered their peaceful suburban neighborhood. How had it come to this? How could someone like Michael, a quiet, isolated man, be capable of such brutality? The answers were complicated, but for the Parker family, the only thing that truly mattered was that they had lost the person they loved most. No amount of justice could ever change that. The aftermath of the shooting sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Cleveland community. The Parker family's home, once a symbol of safety and comfort, became a crime scene. The neighbors who had once shared casual conversations with Sarah on walks and waved to her children as they played in the yard now stood in silent disbelief. The once bustling street, where children often rode bikes and played hopscotch on warm summer days, had become a place marked by the horrific events of September 16th. It was as if the innocence of the neighborhood had been stolen in an instant. In the days that followed, the news spread across the city, and the case quickly became a focal point of local media. Michael Freeman, the quiet, reclusive neighbor, was now the subject of intense public scrutiny. People who had only known him by sight were suddenly forced to confront the reality that someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such an extraordinary act of violence. For many, the news was a chilling reminder that danger could lurk behind the closed doors of even the most unassuming houses. As the investigation into the shooting unfolded, details of Michael's troubled past began to surface. The police uncovered a long history of erratic behavior, including a series of incidents that had raised concerns among his neighbors. One neighbor recalled a time when Michael had become irate after a minor altercation with a delivery driver, shouting at him for parking too close to his property line. Another recalled Michael muttering about the world being unfair, complaining about how people never seemed to appreciate his hardships. These instances, while alarming, had never escalated to the point of violence, and no one had suspected that Michael was capable of such an act. Many had simply chalked it up to his eccentricities, never imagining that he harbored such deep-seated anger. Yet, when investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Michael's anger had been building for months. He had been struggling with the recent loss of his job, which had compounded his feelings of isolation. The lack of meaningful social connections had left him feeling more and more disconnected from the world around him. Michael had become consumed by bitterness, and every minor irritation felt like a personal affront. The Parker family's laughter, the image of Sarah's children playing in the yard, became the final trigger that pushed him over the edge. It was as though, in that moment, Michael saw in their happiness everything he had lost in his own life. a life he felt had been unfairly derailed by circumstances beyond his control. Investigators also discovered that Michael had been seeking professional help for his mental health issues, but his attempts at treatment had been inconsistent. He had attended therapy on and off for several years, but had never fully committed to the process. The underlying issues, his depression, anger, and feelings of worthlessness, remained unresolved. His decision to purchase a firearm was seen as the final, fatal step in his mental unraveling. The gun, which he had obtained through an unlicensed seller, was never registered, and it was clear that Michael had never fully thought through the consequences of using it. As the police pieced together the timeline of events, they learned that Michael had planned the shooting in advance. He had spent hours before leaving his home, sitting with the gun in his lap, contemplating the actions he was about to take. In his twisted mind, the Parker family's happiness had become a symbol of everything he felt he was denied, and the violence was his misguided way of reclaiming some sense of control over his life. He had no plan for what would happen afterward, no thought about the lives he would ruin, the children he would traumatize, or the community he would tear apart. To Michael, the gun had become a tool to silence the anger that had been building inside of him for years. The Parker family's reaction to the tragedy was one of profound grief and disbelief. Sarah's husband, David, had survived the attack but was left with both physical and emotional scars. The bullet wound to his leg would take months to heal, but it was the psychological trauma that would haunt him for much longer. He had been unable to save his wife, unable to protect his children from the horror that had unfolded on their front lawn. In the days following the shooting, David struggled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy. He wrestled with the thought that, if only he had reacted differently or faster, perhaps Sarah would still be alive. But those questions would remain unanswered, and the weight of that loss would be something he would carry with him forever. For the children, Emma and Lucas, the trauma of that night would shape their futures. Emma, the older of the two, would suffer from nightmares and flashbacks. She would often ask her father why the bad man had hurt their family, and whether he would ever come back. Lucas, too young to fully understand the situation, became withdrawn, struggling to express his emotions. In the months following the shooting, both children were enrolled in therapy, but the scars left by Michael Freeman's actions were deep and would take years to heal. No amount of counseling or support could erase the images burned into their memories. The sight of their mother lying on the ground, the sound of gunshots, and the chaos that followed. As Michael's trial approached, the public's reaction was a mixture of outrage, confusion, and sorrow. Many in the community were left wondering how such a tragedy could have occurred in their seemingly quiet and peaceful neighborhood. The questions surrounding Michael's mental health, his gun ownership, and his apparent inability to seek help for his anger became central to the legal proceedings. The prosecution argued that Michael's actions were premeditated, a deliberate choice to commit an act of violence against a family he had never truly known. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to his troubled past, his struggles with mental illness, and his history of instability as factors that had contributed to his breakdown. As the trial continued, it became clear that Michael Freeman's story was not just one of a man who had lost control in a moment of rage, but also one of a society that had failed to address the complex issues surrounding mental health, isolation, and access to firearms. The debate over gun control, the availability of mental health resources, and the need for stronger community support systems became more urgent than ever before. Michael's actions were a painful reminder of the consequences of neglecting these issues. For the Parker family, the trial was a painful and drawn-out process. Every day in the courtroom brought fresh anguish as they were forced to relive the horrors of that night. But through it all, they remained steadfast in their commitment to each other. They sought justice not just for Sarah, but for the future of their children, whose lives had been forever altered by Michael Freeman's violent outburst. They knew that the road to healing would be long and uncertain, but they also understood that, in the end, their strength as a family would be what carried them through. In the coming months, as the trial concluded, Michael Freeman was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and child endangerment. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the chance to harm another family. But for the Parker family, justice could never fully undo the damage caused by his actions. It was a hollow victory, one that could never bring Sarah back or repair the trauma inflicted on Emma and Lucas. The only thing they could do was try to move forward, and in doing so, honor Sarah's memory in the best way they knew how, by loving each other, supporting one another, and finding peace in the face of unimaginable loss. The months following the trial brought little relief for the Parker family. Despite the guilty verdict and the conviction that ensured Michael Freeman would never be able to hurt anyone again, the emotional scars remained. In the quiet moments of reflection, David often found himself wrestling with the enormity of the loss. His wife, the woman he had spent nearly 2 decades with, was gone. The children, though young, had experienced something no child should ever have to witness. Emma's eyes, once bright with innocence, were now shadowed with an understanding of a world much harsher than she should have known at such a young age. David would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sound of gunshots still ringing in his ears. He would hear his children's screams, feel the weight of his wife's body falling to the ground, and replay the moment he tried so desperately to protect her, only to be too late. It was a brutal loop of guilt and helplessness that no amount of time could seem to erase. There were days when he felt as though the grief would swallow him whole, and the weight of it all would press him so hard that he thought he might collapse under it. The children struggled in their own ways. Emma became withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone outside of her family. She was often found drawing pictures that seemed to capture a haunting scene, a house surrounded by darkness, with a small figure standing alone in the center. It wasn't until months later that David realized the figure in Emma's drawings was always her mother, standing alone and distant, as though frozen in time. Emma had stopped talking about the shooting, but it was clear that the trauma had seeped into every corner of her young mind. Lucas, too young to fully understand the gravity of what had happened, exhibited signs of distress in his own way. He would ask David why they couldn't go to the park anymore, or why they couldn't have their old family outings, like the ones they had before that day. The familiar spaces of their once idyllic life now felt cold and foreign. His questions, innocent as they were, only reminded David of how much had been taken from them, how much had been stolen from his children. Despite the intense grief, David knew that he couldn't allow the darkness to fully consume them. He worked tirelessly to ensure that his children would receive the support they needed to process their trauma. He enrolled Emma and Lucas in therapy, though he understood that the road to healing would be long. There were no quick fixes, no simple solutions to undo the horrors they had witnessed. All David could do was be there for them, providing whatever sense of stability he could muster, even as his own world felt like it was falling apart. The Parker family found solace in the small, everyday moments that began to take root in their lives once again. They would spend time together, as best as they could, even if it was just sitting in silence in the living room or walking around the neighborhood they once knew. Slowly, the tight-knit community that had rallied around them began to rebuild itself. Neighbors who had been shocked by the tragedy now offered their support, coming by with casseroles, cards, and words of encouragement. They were trying to piece together a sense of normalcy, despite the darkness that had forever changed the landscape of their lives. One day, as Emma and David sat in the living room, watching the sun begin to set, Emma finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it was the first time she had opened up about her feelings in months. "Daddy," she said, her eyes meeting his, "do you think Mommy is in heaven?" David paused, his heart aching, as he processed the question. His emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but he kept them in check for his daughter's sake. "Yes, sweetheart," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I believe your Mommy is in heaven, watching over us." Emma nodded, her small hands folding in her lap. There was a quiet understanding in her eyes, as though the weight of her question had finally been answered in a way that gave her some peace, even if it was only temporary. It wasn't a cure, not by any means, but it was a step, a small, tentative step toward healing. David knew that it would be years before the children could truly begin to process what had happened. There would be good days and bad days, and he would be there for them through it all, offering the love and support they needed, even when he wasn't sure how to help himself. But there was one thing he could do. He could be a constant presence in their lives. He could show them that, despite the pain, life could continue. And slowly, through time and support, they could begin to rebuild what had been shattered. The pain of losing Sarah would never truly fade. There would always be moments when the grief would come crashing back, moments when David would hear her voice in his mind, moments when he would long for her touch, her laugh, and the life they had shared together. But through it all, he clung to the memory of her strength, her kindness, and her love. Sarah Parker had been a beacon of light in his life, and though she was gone, that light would continue to guide him in the years to come. In the courtroom, Michael Freeman's fate had been sealed. His conviction had come swiftly, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for David and his children, the punishment was of little consequence. Michael Freeman's actions had irrevocably altered their lives, and no sentence, no matter how harsh, could undo the damage he had caused. His family was left to live with the consequences of his violent outburst, an outburst that had taken the life of a mother, shattered the lives of her children, and torn apart a community. The finality of Michael's conviction brought a small sense of justice, but it did little to ease the pain. David knew that the true work of healing had only just begun. He would have to continue moving forward, even though every step felt like a struggle. The Parker family's road to recovery would be long, but David was determined that they would heal together. He would honor Sarah's memory, not by holding on to the past, but by helping his children find a way to live with the tragedy that had forever shaped their lives. Though Michael Freeman had been sentenced to prison, his actions had created a ripple effect that would continue to echo in the Parker family's lives. They would never be the same, but in time, they would find a way to move forward, one day at a time, one step at a time, holding on to the love that had once defined their family, and finding strength in each other as they navigated a world that had become all too dangerous and unpredictable.